Blue Coast Studio presents The 1%, a psychological thriller written by Nathan Voss. A young officer, a dead suspect's brain tissue, and memories no one can explain. We hope you enjoy, and don't forget to subscribe. Chapter 1. The Gene. The gene was discovered on a Tuesday in April in a laboratory at Johns Hopkins where a postdoctoral researcher named Helen Tsai was mapping the neurogenomic markers of impulse control. What she found instead was a specific variant on the short arm of chromosome 11, a mutation present in less than 0.5% of the population, but present in every confirmed clinical psychopath whose tissue had been archived in the National Forensic Databank. Every single one. The correlation was absolute. The implications were immediate. Within 6 months, a prenatal screening test existed. Within a year, 43 states had introduced legislation. The referendum in the 44th state, this city, was the one that made national news, because this city had produced the headhunter. And the headhunter's trial was still echoing through the courtrooms when the ballot measure arrived. The question, stripped of its legal language, was simple. Should parents be required to terminate a pregnancy if the fetus carried the variant? Not permitted. Required. The word mattered. People held signs outside polling places and screamed at each other about destiny and choice, and whether a strand of protein was the same thing as a soul. Editorials invoked Nuremberg. Counter-editorials invoked the 7 headless corpses. Cable pundits gave it a name that stuck, the psychopath gene. And for one long, ugly autumn, the city became the center of a conversation nobody was equipped to have. The referendum failed by 4 points. Society chose to let the gene exist, chose to trust that environment, upbringing, the accumulated weight of a human life lived among other humans would be enough to hold the line, that nature was not destiny, that the blood did not speak louder than the world. It was a noble conclusion. It was also, in retrospect, a bet. The headhunter's name was Edward Brandt, and before the tabloids and the courtroom sketches and the life sentence without parole, he had been a respected surgeon. He had practiced for 19 years at the city's largest hospital. He had published in the Annals of Surgery. He had coached his department's softball team. He also, over the course of 3 years, killed 7 people and removed their heads with a surgical precision that haunted every detective who worked the case. His final victim was a 24-year-old graduate student named Sophia Castillo. Her brother found out the way no one should find out. Not through the chaplain, not through the captain's careful knock on the door, but through the radio. Ray Castillo was already a detective by then, already a decade into homicide, and he was driving to the 7th crime scene when dispatch identified the victim. He heard the name through static and had to pull over because his hands stopped working. The steering wheel suddenly felt like something that belonged to another person's life. He sat on the shoulder of the highway for 11 minutes. He counted them later on the dashcam footage, because counting was the only thing that kept the sound from coming out. When he arrived at the scene, his hands were trembling and his face was emptied of everything. Grief, rage, recognition, as though someone had reached inside and scraped the walls clean. He stood at the perimeter tape and looked at the shape on the ground that had been his sister, and the other detectives watched him the way you watch a building when you hear the foundation crack. Nobody told him to leave. Nobody could find the words. He stood there for 4 minutes, then turned around and went back to work. And he did not stop working the headhunter case until Edward Brandt was in handcuffs 9 weeks later. The arrest was front page, above the fold. The headhunter, unmasked, a surgeon, a neighbor, a man whose hands had healed and destroyed with equal skill. The trial lasted 6 weeks and ended with a sentence that would outlive everyone in the courtroom. There was one detail from the arrest that never made the front page. It ran in a single paragraph on page 12 of the Metro section, below an ad for a furniture liquidation sale. Edward Brandt had a son, a newborn, born the same week as his father's arrest, delivered at Mercy General while the city's most prolific killer was being processed at central booking. The mother was not named in the article. The boy was not named either. He was simply described as the headhunter's infant son, a phrase that carried inside it a question nobody wanted to ask and nobody could stop asking. What now? The referendum had already answered. Society had decided. The gene could exist. The child could live. Humanity would be enough. It had to be. The precinct smelled exactly the way Marcus remembered. Burnt coffee, industrial cleaner, and something underneath both that he had never been able to identify, but associated with the specific ambient exhaustion of people who worked too hard for too little. He stood just inside the double doors and breathed it in, and the familiarity of it loosened something behind his sternum that had been tightened for 6 months. He was back. The thought arrived clean and bright, uncomplicated by the thing he had noticed in the parking lot, the fact that he did not remember the drive in. One moment he had been locking his apartment door, keys in his left hand, messenger bag over his right shoulder, the morning cold and bright on his face. The next moment he was pulling into his assigned spot on the second level of the precinct garage, the engine already cooling, his hands resting on the wheel at 10 and 2. The commute between, 18 minutes on a good day, 25 with school traffic, was simply absent, as though someone had lifted a strip of film from the reel and spliced the remaining ends together so neatly the gap barely showed. His neurologist had warned him about this. Minor cognitive discontinuities during the first year of recovery. Neural pathways rerouting. The brain editing its own experience while it healed. Same way a body running a fever might lose an afternoon. It was normal. It was expected. He had a follow-up appointment in 3 weeks, and he would mention it then. He also could not account for the small, fresh bruise on his right knuckle, purpling and tender when he flexed his hand. He must have hit it on something during the gap. The door frame on the way out, maybe, or the car door. It happened. People bumped into things. He was making too much of it. He shoved the hand into his jacket pocket and walked into the bullpen. Ray Castillo was waiting for him near the coffee station, leaning against the counter with a paper cup in one hand and the particular slouch of a man who had been awake since 5 and intended everyone to know it. His blazer was rumpled. His tie was loosened to the second button. The circles under his eyes were so deep they looked permanent, which they probably were. He looked, Marcus thought, exactly the same, as though 6 months had not passed at all, as though the world had simply held its shape around Ray the way water holds around a stone. Ray looked up, and something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly. Ray didn't smile so much as allow the muscles around his mouth to temporarily relax their default position of skeptical disapproval. But his eyes changed. Something behind them unclenched. "Well," Ray said, "look who decided to show up." "Missed you too, Ray." "I didn't say I missed you. I said I noticed you were here. Those are different things." He pushed off the counter and crossed the 3 steps between them, and then his hand was on Marcus's shoulder, heavy, deliberate, the grip of a man who had practiced losing people. He held it there a beat too long, 2 beats, 3, as though checking that Marcus was solid, that he was real, that this particular loss had, just this once, been given back. "You look good," Ray said, and let go. "I mean, you look terrible, but relative to the guy I saw in the ICU with his head cracked open like a cantaloupe, you look good." That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Don't get used to it. Ray handed him a cup of coffee. It was already made. 2 sugars, no cream. He had remembered. Desk is where you left it. The Wentworth file is still a mess, but that's Patterson's problem now. You're with me. Same rotation? Same rotation. Captain signed off this morning. Ray paused, and the almost smile faded into something more guarded. How are you? Actual answer, not the one you gave the department shrink. Marcus felt the pull of the rehearsed version. I'm doing great. Clearance is full. No complaints. But Ray's eyes were too direct for that. Ray had a way of looking at you that made the performance feel pointless. I'm good, Marcus said. Genuinely. Some fog, some headaches. The scar itches when it rains. He touched his left temple where the thin line ran along his hairline and disappeared into the close-cropped dark hair above his ear. But I'm here, and 6 months ago I almost wasn't, so I'll take it. Ray studied him for another moment, then nodded. Fine, but you tell me if anything's off. Not the shrink, not the captain. Me. Copy. Good. Now drink your coffee. It's going to be a long day, and I don't have the energy to train a replacement. The bullpen filled around them in the ordinary rhythms of a morning shift, and Marcus let himself settle into it. The ringing phones, the murmured conversations, the particular quality of fluorescent light that made everything look like it was happening inside an aquarium. He stopped at his desk and ran his hand along the surface. Someone had cleaned it while he was gone. The surface was bare except for his computer, a blank notepad, and a pen. He sat down and the chair remembered his weight. Over the next hour, the backstory reassembled itself in fragments. Not all at once, but in the way returning colleagues delivered it. Sideways, in doorframe conversations and passing greetings that each added a piece. Welcome back. Glad you're okay. Hell of a thing with Perry. Marcus fielded them with the same measured calm, offering the same compressed version of events each time because repetition made it manageable. 6 months ago, he had confronted Nolan Perry. Perry had been identified as the prime suspect in a string of murders that had terrorized the city the previous year. 5 victims, same signature, same staging. The press calling it the headhunter's second coming, even though the pattern wasn't exactly the same, and the original headhunter was rotting in a maximum security cell 200 miles upstate. The connection was mostly tabloid sensationalism, but the fear was real, and the department had been under enormous pressure to close the case. When the forensic trail led to Perry, a medical resident with access, proximity, and a pattern of behavior that looked damning from every angle, Marcus had been the officer on scene for the arrest. It went wrong immediately. Perry had not surrendered. There had been a struggle, an enclosed space, an escalation that the Department Review Board later classified as unavoidable. Both men were critically injured. Perry died of his injuries at the scene. Marcus had been rushed to Mercy General with catastrophic brain damage, a depressed skull fracture, and acute subdural hemorrhaging that should have killed him. It nearly did. The surgeons had exhausted conventional options when someone, a resident or maybe the attending, the details were never clear to Marcus, made the decision to use Perry's neural tissue for the repair. It was experimental. It was barely legal. It was the only thing left. And it worked. Marcus woke up 11 days later with Nolan Perry's cells knitted into the architecture of his own brain and a scar along his temple that itched when it rained. He thought about Nolan Perry sometimes. Not often, and not with the weight he supposed he should feel. The man had died, and pieces of him had been used to save Marcus's life, and there should have been something in that. Gratitude, grief, the particular discomfort of owing your existence to a dead man's tissue. But when Marcus searched for the feeling, he found only a smooth, clean surface, like reaching for a door handle and finding the door had no handle at all, just wall. His neurologist said the emotional flatness around the event was normal. trauma response, dissociative buffering, the brain protecting itself from processing too much too fast. It would resolve with time. Marcus accepted this. He was good at accepting explanations. The day ended without incident. He filed 2 reports, attended a briefing on active cases that didn't concern him yet, and ate a sandwich at his desk, while Ray complained about the department's new digital evidence portal, which Ray regarded with the same enthusiasm he reserved for tax audits and decaffeinated coffee. It was ordinary. It was mundane. It was the most normal Marcus had felt in 6 months. And by the time he drove home, consciously tracking every mile this time, noting each turn, the route a thread he refused to let slip, he felt something close to peace. His apartment was small and clean, a 1-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building that had been built in the 70s and renovated exactly enough to justify a rent increase. He dropped his bag by the door, hung his jacket on the hook, and stood in the kitchen for a moment, letting the silence settle. The place smelled like lemon cleaner and cold air. He had left a window cracked. He closed it. He made tea. He sat on the couch. He turned on the television and turned it off again. The quiet felt different now, not peaceful exactly, but expectant, as though the apartment was waiting for something. It happened at 9:17. He knew the time because he had just checked his phone, a reflex that had no purpose behind it, and the numbers were still in his peripheral vision when the room dropped away. He was somewhere else. Not dreaming. The texture was wrong for dreaming. Too sharp, too specific. He could smell copper and something floral underneath it, like cheap air freshener failing to cover what it was meant to cover. He could feel the cold of a concrete surface under his feet, could hear the distant buzz of a streetlight cycling on and off with a damaged ballast. The space around him was dim, enclosed, industrial. A storage unit, maybe, or a basement. The walls were cinder block, and in front of him, on the floor, illuminated by a single work lamp angled from above, was a body. He could see it with a clarity that excluded everything else. The positioning, the specific arrangement of limbs, the way the light carved shadows into the stillness. He could see details that should not have been visible from this distance. The pattern of lividity along the skin where blood had settled, the angle of a ligature mark, the precise placement of the hands. And he was not observing this as a bystander. He was not behind crime scene tape. He was not holding a flashlight or a camera. He was standing over the body the way someone stands over their own work. Close, proprietary. The perspective was above and forward, and his hands, the hands he could see at the lower edge of his vision, not entirely in focus, were still. The vision lasted less than 10 seconds. Then the apartment reassembled itself around him, the couch, the tea growing cold on the coffee table, his phone still glowing with the time. And he was sitting exactly where he had been, his breathing slightly elevated, his pulse knocking against the thin skin of his wrists. He sat very still for a long time. Then he stood, went to his bedroom, and retrieved the journal his neurologist had given him, a plain black notebook with lined pages, meant for tracking symptoms. He opened it to the first blank page, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote the date, the time, and a description of what he had seen. His handwriting was steady, his language was precise. He noted the sensory components: smell, temperature, sound, visual acuity. He noted the perspective and the emotional quality, which was, and he paused here, pen hovering, calm. The vision had been calm, not frightening, not chaotic, not the fever-bright confusion of a nightmare. It had felt like remembering. The surgeons had warned him about this, in the cautious, hedging way that surgeons warn about things they cannot fully explain. Phantom sensory experiences were possible after the kind of procedure he had undergone. Neural tissue carried electrochemical patterns. Grafted tissue might retain residual encoding. His neurologist had been more direct. Memory transfer through transplanted neural tissue was theoretically possible, but clinically unsupported. There was no peer-reviewed evidence. There was speculation, anecdotal claims, fringe papers. Nothing solid. But Nolan Perry's tissue was in his brain. Nolan Perry had been at crime scenes, had killed at crime scenes if the investigation was right. And Marcus had just seen a crime scene from the inside, with a vividness that exceeded anything his own imagination had ever produced. The explanation assembled itself with a logic that felt almost grateful. Nolan's tissue, Nolan's memories, residual neural encoding surfacing through the graft, triggered by the return to the environment and routines that his brain associated with police work. It was speculative, yes. Clinically unsupported, yes. But it was an explanation, and it fit. And Marcus needed it to fit the way a man standing on a ledge needs the railing to hold. He closed the journal. Unlike the lost commute, unlike the bruise on his knuckle that still throbbed faintly when he pressed his thumb against it, the vision had a framework. It had a cause he could name and a mechanism he could accept. The morning's gap, the missing 18 minutes, the unmarked drive, the injury without origin. Those had floated in a space without edges, and that space had frightened him more than he wanted to admit. The vision was different. The vision was Nolan's. The vision made sense. He put the journal in the drawer beside his bed. He washed his tea mug and set it on the rack. He brushed his teeth and checked the lock on the front door twice, and stood for a moment in the dark hallway, listening to the building breathe around him. When he slept soundly. He did not dream, or if he did, the dreams were gone by morning. He raced as cleanly as the drive to work, as the minutes between locking his door and arriving at the precinct, as whatever had happened to his knuckle in the hours his mind chose not to record. All of it gone, all of it tidy, the brain editing its own experience while it healed. That was the explanation. He held it the way a drowning man holds a piece of wood, not because he trusted it to save him, but because letting go was worse. Chapter 2. Fresh Blood. The call came at 6:14 in the morning, and Marcus was already awake. He had been awake for 20 minutes, sitting on the edge of his bed in the gray half-light, staring at his hands. They looked normal. They looked like his hands. He had been cataloging them the way he might catalog evidence. The knuckle lines, the short nails, the faint bruise on his right hand, now yellowing at the edges. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, and he picked it up before the second ring. Ray's voice was flat, in the way that meant something bad. "We caught one. Industrial storage complex off Maddox, north side. Same staging, same signature." Marcus felt his chest go still. Same as last year? Same as last year. Neither of them said Nolan Perry's name. Neither of them had to. Marcus dressed in 4 minutes, brushed his teeth, grabbed his badge and messenger bag. The symptom journal sat in the bedside drawer where he had left it. He thought about bringing it, then didn't. His scar itched faintly along his temple, a low electric hum that had nothing to do with rain. The drive took 11 minutes at that hour. He remembered every second of it. The storage complex was a grid of corrugated metal buildings set behind a chain-link fence on a dead-end road that backed up to the railroad tracks. 2 patrol cars and an unmarked sedan were already there, their lights painting the pre-dawn fog in alternating red and blue. Crime scene tape had been strung across the entrance to the 3rd row of units, and a uniformed officer with a clipboard stood at the perimeter looking like he wished he had called in sick. Ray was waiting by the unmarked sedan with 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to Marcus without a word. 2 sugars, no cream. The gesture was automatic, familiar, and Marcus took it with a nod that carried the same weight. "Unit 17, Ray said. "Groundskeeper found it 40 minutes ago. Came in early to deal with a burst pipe 2 rows over. Smelled something wrong. Tried the door. It wasn't locked." "Never locked," Marcus said. The words left his mouth before he processed them. He meant the original cases, Nolan Perry's cases, as the department still classified them. In 4 of the 5 murders attributed to the Second Coming, the bodies had been left in spaces with unlocked doors. Not forced, not picked. The killer had either obtained keys or found locations that were already accessible. It was a detail buried in the case files Marcus had reviewed during his recovery, a pattern the lead detectives had noted without giving it much weight. Ray glanced at him over the rim of his coffee. "Right, same as before." They suited up in nitrile gloves and paper booties. The walk to Unit 17 was 40 yards of cracked asphalt and weeds pushing through the seams. Marcus could smell it before they reached the door. That copper sweetness layered under something chemical, something floral. And beneath both of those, the flat, mineral scent of concrete that had absorbed heat and then lost it overnight. He stopped walking. Ray, 2 steps ahead, turned back. "You good?" "Yeah." Marcus flexed his fingers inside the gloves. "Yeah, I'm fine." He was not fine. The smell had landed in his brain with the precision of a key entering a lock, and behind his eyes something shifted, a translucence like looking through 2 panes of glass at once. He could see the open door of Unit 17 ahead of him. He could also see it differently, from inside, looking out. The work lamp throwing a cone of white light across a concrete floor that he knew was cold, because he remembered the cold transferring through the soles of his shoes. They stepped inside. The victim was a woman in her early 40s. She lay on the concrete floor in the center of the unit, positioned with a deliberateness that made Marcus's stomach tighten. Her hands had been placed at her sides, palms up, fingers slightly curled. Her clothing was undisturbed. There was no visible blood, no indication of a struggle. The ligature mark around her throat was a thin, dark line, precise, controlled, the work of someone who understood exactly how much pressure was required and applied no more. Her head was intact. That was the deviation from the original headhunter pattern, the same deviation the Second Coming murders had followed. The staging echoed Edward Brandt's work but stopped short of the signature decapitation, as though the killer were paying homage to a template he chose not to complete. Marcus stood 6 feet from the body and felt the doubled vision intensify. The work lamp was positioned to his left, exactly where the lamp in his vision the previous night had been. The concrete was the same gray. The dimensions of the space were different. This unit was wider, newer. But the staging was identical to what he had seen at 917 the night before. "Hands," he said. Ray looked at him. "The hands. Check the positioning. The right hand, specifically. The ligature used to tie the wrists during restraint, before they were repositioned post-mortem. It's a double-column knot with a locking hitch. You won't see it now because the restraints were removed, but there'll be a secondary impression on the right wrist, narrower than the left, because the knot was tighter on that side." Ray crouched beside the body without touching it. He angled his flashlight across the victim's right wrist, moving the beam slowly. In the raking light, the skin revealed what direct illumination had hidden. 2 parallel impressions, the deeper one closer to the heel of the palm, the shallower one a centimeter above it. On the left wrist, there was only one. Ray stood up. He did not look at Marcus immediately. He turned his flashlight off and slid it back into his jacket pocket, and his right hand drifted to his left, his thumb pressing absently against the thick scar across his knuckle from a decades-old arrest. "How'd you know that?" he asked. His voice was conversational, collegial, the voice of a partner asking how a partner figured something out. Nothing more. "The vision," Marcus said. "Last night, I told you I've been getting them. Nolan's memories. They include details like this, procedural elements, restraint methods, staging sequences. The tissue is carrying more than just visual data. The vision you had last night told you about a murder that was committed last night. I think the tissue is encoding patterns, not specific events. The knot technique would be consistent across all the kills. It's a behavioral signature, same as the staging." Ray nodded slowly. He looked at the body again, then at Marcus, and his expression was unreadable. Not suspicious exactly, not yet, but something had shifted behind his eyes like a gear engaging, a tooth finding its groove. "That's remarkable," Ray said. "That's really something." He turned and walked toward the door to flag the crime scene technicians. Marcus watched him go and noticed Ray's hand still resting against his scarred knuckle, pressing. The forensic team arrived in full within 20 minutes. Marcus stayed near the perimeter, observing, keeping his hands in his pockets. The doubled vision had faded, but left a residue, a kind of thermal afterimage, like staring at a bright light and then closing your eyes. He could feel the contours of the space without looking at them. He knew the lamp was positioned 37 inches from the body's left shoulder. He knew this because he remembered placing it there. No, he knew this because Nolan Perry had placed it there. Because Nolan Perry's neural tissue retained the motor patterns, the spatial reasoning, the meticulous arrangement of a killer who understood lighting and angles and how a scene should look when it was finished. The explanation held. Marcus made it hold. He pressed his weight against the framework, the way you brace against a door when something on the other side is pushing. The lead crime scene tech, a woman named De Silva, with steady hands and no tolerance for detectives who touched things, confirmed the double-column knot impression within the hour. She called it unusual, not in any of their existing reference databases. She would run it against the original Second Coming case files, but she was fairly certain it wasn't cataloged there either. Ray took the call, standing next to Marcus in the parking lot. He listened, said, "Thanks," and hung up. "Knot patterns not in the files," he told Marcus. "Not from last year's cases, not from the original Headhunter cases. Brand new to the database." He paused. "But you saw it. Nolan's tissue. The memories are more detailed than I expected. Detailed enough to know something the forensic lab doesn't. If Perry used that knot technique and nobody documented it, it would still be encoded in his neural patterns. The tissue doesn't know what's in a case file and what isn't." Ray considered this. His face gave nothing away. "Makes sense," he said, and the way he said it, level, accepting, a door closing quietly, made Marcus want to believe that it did. They spent the next 3 hours processing the scene, interviewing the groundskeeper, canvassing the adjacent businesses. Marcus moved through the work with the focused clarity that had always made him good at this job. He took notes, he asked the right questions, he stood at the correct distances and did not contaminate evidence, and spoke to witnesses with the measured calm that made people trust him. And beneath all of it, running like a wire through wet clay, was the knowledge he could not yet allow himself to hold. Nolan Perry had been dead for 6 months. Whatever happened in that storage unit happened last night or early this morning. No transplanted memory, no residual encoding, no neural pattern from a dead man's tissue could account for knowledge of an event that occurred after the donor died. Marcus told himself the knot pattern was historical, consistent across all kills, encoded in Perry's motor memory from previous murders. The temporal alignment with last night was coincidence. His vision had contained elements that overlapped with this scene because the killer's methodology was repetitive. He told himself this in the front seat of his car, in the precinct parking garage with the engine off and his hands flat on his thighs. He told himself this carefully, word by word, the way a man recites a prayer he no longer believes in but cannot afford to stop saying. The precinct was louder than usual when he and Ray came through the double doors. Word had spread. 5 murders attributed to Nolan Perry. Case closed. Suspect dead. And now a 6th body wearing the same signature, like a uniform. The bullpen hummed with the particular energy that Marcus recognized as controlled panic. The kind that masquerades as professionalism, where everyone moves a little faster and speaks a little less, and the coffee pot empties twice as fast. Captain had already scheduled a briefing for noon. The options were laid out in the hallway conversations Marcus passed through on his way to his desk. Copycat, accomplice, or error. Either someone was replicating Nolan Perry's work from publicly available case details, or Perry had a partner no one detected. Or the department had pinned 5 murders on the wrong man, and the real killer was still breathing. Nobody said the third option loudly. It sat in the room like a held breath. Marcus was at his desk, writing up his field notes when she appeared. He noticed her before she spoke. She was standing in the doorway of the small conference room adjacent to the bullpen, a manila folder against her chest, watching the room with the contained alertness of someone cataloging exits. Shoulder-length dark hair pulled back in a practical twist. Hazel eyes that moved from face to face without lingering. She wore a dark blazer over a simple blouse, and her sleeves came down to her wrists. She caught him looking and held his gaze for a beat longer than strangers normally do. "Detective Cole?" She crossed to his desk. "I'm Elena Marsh, Victim Advocacy. I've been assigned to the new case." He stood. She had a firm handshake, dry and brief. Up close, he could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes that suggested either 30 approaching or 28 with mileage. "You're the one who came back," she said. Not a question. The way she said it carried no pity and no particular fascination, just acknowledgement, the way you note a fact because it's relevant to the landscape. "6 months ago. I'm fine." "That's what they always say." The faintest smile. The victim's name was Claire Hensley, 42, divorced, worked nights at a distribution warehouse. Her sister reported her missing yesterday afternoon. Marcus took the folder she offered. Inside was a preliminary intake sheet, a next-of-kin contact form, and a photocopy of a driver's license. Claire Hensley looked out from the small rectangular photo with an expression of mild irritation, the universal face of anyone who has ever stood in line at the Department of Motor Vehicles. "Has the sister been notified?" he asked. "An hour ago. She's coming in this afternoon. I'll be present for the interview, if that works with your schedule." "It does." Elena nodded and turned to leave, then stopped. She turned back. "I worked the headhunter coverage," she said, "before I switched to advocacy. I was a journalist, local outlet, crime beat. I covered the trial, the aftermath, the second coming cases. I remember your byline." He didn't, actually. But the lie came easily, a professional courtesy, and something in her expression told him she knew it was a lie, and chose to let it pass. "I have research from that period, files I never published, interviews, background material, some of Nolan Perry's personal documents that were released after the case closed." She paused. "Among them, a draft letter he wrote to his parents, never sent. I found it in a box of his effects that a colleague passed along." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a small displacement, like a picture frame knocked slightly crooked on a wall. "What does it say?" He wrote, "When they see what I found, they'll know I was trying to help." Elena said the words precisely, the way someone quotes a passage they have read many times. "I don't know what he found. The letter wasn't finished, but it's been sitting with me since I read it." The silence between them lasted 3 seconds. In that silence, Marcus heard the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the distant rattle of the coffee maker, and Ray's voice down the hall asking someone about a parking permit. And beneath all of those sounds, a much quieter thing. The first faint fracture in the accepted story of Nolan Perry. "That doesn't sound like something a killer writes," Marcus said. "No," Elena agreed. "It doesn't." She held his gaze for another beat, then walked away. Marcus watched her cross the bullpen and disappear around the corner toward the victim services wing. He sat down at his desk and opened Claire Hensley's folder, but he was not reading it. He was thinking about a dead man writing to his parents about something he had found, and how the word "help" sounded in a sentence about a man everyone had agreed was a monster. The briefing at noon confirmed what Marcus already knew, but could not admit to knowing. The knot pattern from the crime scene had no match in any existing database, including the 5 Second Coming case files. De Silva presented her findings with clinical precision. A double-column restraint with a locking hitch, applied pre-mortem, removed post-mortem, leaving distinctive dual impressions on the right wrist. The technique suggested training or practice. It was not something an imitator could replicate from news coverage, because it had never been made public. The copycat theory lost its footing. The accomplice theory gained. Marcus sat through the briefing with his hands folded on the table and his face arranged in the attentive neutrality that had become his default expression. Twice he caught Ray watching him from across the room, and both times Ray looked away with the ease of a man who was simply scanning the table. It meant nothing. Partners checked on each other during briefings. It was reflex. But Ray's humor, which normally surfaced during briefings the way air bubbles rise in standing water, a murmured aside, a half-smile at someone's awkward phrasing, was absent. Ray sat with his scarred knuckle pressed against his jawline and said very little. The afternoon spent itself on witness interviews and database queries that produced nothing useful. Claire Hensley had no connection to any of the 5 previous victims beyond geographic proximity. She had no criminal record, no known enemies, no overlapping social circles with Nolan Perry. She was, by every metric available, a random selection. Marcus worked steadily through the hours and felt almost normal. The doubled vision did not return. The scar along his temple settled into its usual background ache. He drank 2 more cups of coffee and ate half a sandwich from the vending machine, and filed his reports with the careful precision that he was known for. At 5:30, the bullpen was thinning out. Marcus packed his messenger bag and headed for the parking garage. The concrete stairwell echoed with his footsteps, and somewhere below him a car door slammed, and the garage smelled of exhaust and old oil and cold concrete. And the cold concrete triggered nothing. No vision, no doubled glass, just a parking garage at the end of a long day. Elena was standing beside a dark blue sedan 3 spaces from the garage exit, keys in hand, not getting in. She was looking at her phone with an expression that Marcus recognized, the face of someone reading something that confirmed what they already suspected and wished they were wrong about. She looked up as he approached. "Detective?" "Marcus," he said. A pause. "Marcus." She put her phone away. Claire Hensley's sister was gutted, completely gutted. I sat with her for 90 minutes, and I don't think she took a full breath the entire time. That's the hardest part of the job. It's the whole job. The rest is paperwork. The evening had turned cool. The garage funneled a draft between the parked cars that smelled of damp asphalt and the first green notes of an early spring no one had been paying attention to. In the half-light of the overhead fluorescence, Elena's face was divided into planes of shadow and weak yellow illumination, and Marcus found himself studying the geometry of it. The set of her jaw, the line of her throat, the way her eyes narrowed slightly when she was deciding whether to trust someone. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask." "The visions, the ones from the transplant, do they scare you?" He should have said yes. A normal person would have said yes, and he knew this. And the knowing was its own kind of answer. "They're disorienting," he said, "like remembering someone else's life. But the fear is more about what they mean than what they show." "What do they mean?" "That part of him is in me, literally. Whatever he saw, whatever he did, some of it's encoded in the tissue, and my brain is reading it like its own memory. The doctors say it's possible. They can't prove it, and they can't disprove it." Elena leaned against her car. She crossed her arms, then uncrossed them, a small negotiation with herself. "When I was 23, she said, I was living in a walk-up near Fulton Street, 4th floor, thin walls. One night I heard something through the wall, my neighbor's apartment. It sounded wrong." Marcus waited. "I should have called the police. That's what everyone said afterward. But I went to check. Her door was unlocked, and Edward Brandt was standing in her living room." The name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. "I didn't see his face clearly. It was dark, and he moved fast. He had a knife. He cut me before I could get back through the door." She pulled her left sleeve up to her elbow. The garage light fell across a constellation of scars along her forearm. 3 parallel lines, white and slightly raised, the kind of scars that come from a blade drawn across skin with force, but without the precision of someone trying to kill. The cuts of a man, interrupted, defending his exit, slashing at an obstacle. "I fought free," she said. "I ran down 4 flights and out the front door, and I didn't stop until I was standing in the middle of the street in my bare feet." Elena. The connection to the headhunter wasn't confirmed for years. DNA evidence from my wound eventually matched. At the time, my testimony was considered unreliable because I couldn't identify my attacker. But I know what I walked into. She pulled her sleeve down. The gesture was practiced, but not performative. She had shown this before, to people she chose, on her terms. "People ask me if I think about it, whether it defines me. And the answer is that it happened to me, but it's not what I am." She looked at Marcus with an expression that he would remember for the rest of his life. Open, steady, certain. Identity isn't what's inside your skull. It's what you choose to do with it. That's what I learned standing in the street in my bare feet. I chose to survive that. Everything after was a choice too. Marcus felt the words enter him the way water enters dry ground. Not all at once, but in a slow, spreading saturation. He wanted to hold those words. He wanted to believe they applied to him, that whatever was inside his skull, Perry's tissue, Perry's memories, the visions that came with a calm he could not explain, was separate from who he was. A condition, not an identity. Something he carried, not something he was. "I think Nolan Perry's letter matters," Elena said. "I think someone should look at what he found." "I think you're right." She smiled. It was small and careful, and it changed the geometry of her face entirely. "Good night, Marcus." "Good night." He watched her get in her car and pull out of the garage. Then he stood alone in the concrete space, with the draft curling around his ankles. And he thought about Nolan Perry writing to his parents about trying to help, and Elena pulling up her sleeve under fluorescent light to show a stranger what surviving looked like, and the double-column knot that no case file had ever recorded, but that he had seen as clearly as his own hands. He went home. His apartment was dark and quiet, and exactly as he had left it. He dropped his messenger bag by the door and stood in the kitchen without turning on the lights, letting his eyes adjust. The building settled around him in its familiar language of ticking pipes and muffled television from the unit below. He sat at the kitchen table with the crime scene photographs spread in front of him. He did not remember taking them out of the folder. They were there, fanned across the table in the order he had apparently arranged them, and his hands were resting flat on either side of them, and the clock on the microwave read 8:47. He looked at the photographs. He looked at the timestamp on the forensic report. He looked at the date. And then he went backward in his mind to the vision he had recorded in his symptom journal the previous night. The one at 9:17, the body in the cinder block space, the work lamp, the cold concrete, the calm. The storage unit where Claire Hensley was found did not have cinder block walls. It had corrugated metal. The dimensions were different. The lighting was different. But the staging was identical. More importantly, the forensic team had estimated time of death between 10 in the evening and 2 in the morning. Marcus had experienced his vision at 9:17, before the estimated window. Nolan Perry's tissue could not provide memories of events that had not yet occurred. Residual neural encoding, however elaborate, however detailed, was a recording of the past. It could not anticipate the future. Unless the vision was not of this murder. Unless it was a memory of one of the original 5 kills, surfacing with similar staging elements that his brain overlaid onto the current scene. Yes, that was it. A prior memory, triggered by the return to fieldwork, contaminated by proximity to a new scene with matching characteristics. Temporal distortion. The brain conflating 2 similar events, the old and the new, producing a hybrid that felt prophetic but was merely confused. Marcus built this explanation carefully, brick by brick, the mortar still wet. He tested its weight. He pressed against it. It held, barely. The way a wall holds when you can see the first hairline crack running from floor to ceiling, but the structure has not yet begun to lean. He gathered the photographs and put them back in the folder. He washed his hands of the kitchen sink, and that was when he saw it. Under the nail of his left index finger, wedged into the crescent where nail met skin, was a dark residue. Not dirt, not ink, not grease. It was a deep brownish red, almost black in the dim kitchen. And it was packed tight against the nail bed, the way a substance gets packed when you grip something with force. Marcus turned on the faucet. He picked up the dish brush. He scrubbed under the nail, watching the water in the basin turn faintly pink, then clear, then pink again as he moved to the next finger. He checked each nail systematically. The left index and middle finger both carried the residue. The right hand was clean. The water ran. The brush scraped against his skin. He scrubbed until the nails were raw and the cuticle stung and the residue was gone. All of it, swirling down the drain in a pale dilution that meant nothing because it was nothing. Because there was an explanation for this, too. There had to be. There was, always. His internal voice caught, stumbled, restarted. There was always an explanation. The residue was from the crime scene. He had been wearing gloves, but perhaps a glove had torn. Perhaps during the canvass of the adjacent units. Perhaps he had touched a surface and not noticed. He had been thorough about the gloves, but he was recovering from brain surgery, and his attention was imperfect, and there were gaps. He knew about the gaps. The neurologist had warned him about the gaps. The explanation arrived, and it did not fit properly, and Marcus forced it into place the way you force a drawer that is swollen with humidity. Pressing harder than you should, hearing something give that should not give, accepting the result because the alternative was a drawer that would not close. He dried his hands. He stood at the sink for a long time. 3 miles away, in the fluorescent silence of the homicide bullpen, Ray Castillo sat alone at his desk. Everyone else had gone home. The coffee pot was cold. The overhead lights hummed their persistent insect drone, and the cleaning crew would not arrive for another hour. Ray opened his bottom desk drawer and took out a fresh notebook. Not the department-issued kind. A drugstore composition book with a black and white mottled cover, the kind that costs $2 and cannot be accessed through any official records request. He uncapped a pen. At the top of the first page, he wrote the date. Below it, in his compressed, slanting handwriting, he began to write. Marcus Cole, first day on scene, identified double-column knot pattern with locking hitch on victim's right wrist. Technique not documented in any existing case file. Lab confirmed post-processing. No known source for this information. He wrote for several minutes. He documented the specifics of Marcus's statement, the language Marcus had used, the confidence, the way the knowledge had emerged fully formed rather than deduced. He noted the time of Marcus's disclosure relative to the lab's confirmation. He noted that Marcus attributed his knowledge to visions derived from Nolan Perry's transplanted neural tissue. He noted that this explanation required Perry's tissue to contain information about a crime committed 6 months after Perry's death. Ray put the pen down. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, and then his gaze dropped to the framed photograph on the corner of his desk. Sophia, at 22, taken at a family barbecue 2 years before she died. She was laughing at something off camera, her dark hair caught in mid-motion, her features echoing Ray's own in the way that family resemblances do. The same deep-set eyes, the same line of the jaw. He looked at her for a long time. "Professional due diligence," he said to the empty room. His voice was quiet and carried the particular flatness of a man trying to convince himself that the thing he is doing is smaller than it actually is. He closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer. He turned off his desk lamp and sat in the dark for another minute, listening to the building settle, listening to the hum. Then he went home. He did not call Marcus. He did not tell anyone about the notebook. He told himself this was prudence, not suspicion. He told himself that documenting inconsistencies was what good detectives did, and that caring about someone did not exempt them from scrutiny, and that the tightness in his chest was just the long day catching up with him. He told himself these things the way Marcus told himself things, carefully, deliberately, in the measured voice of a man constructing a story that he needed to be true. The difference was that Ray's story was falling apart because of the evidence, and Marcus's was falling apart because of its absence. Chapter 3. The Fracture. Ray brought coffee the next morning. 2 sugars, no cream. He set the cup on Marcus's desk without a word and dropped into his own chair across the narrow aisle, the springs groaning under his weight in the familiar way they always did. But he did not lean back. He did not prop his feet on the open-bottom drawer. He did not say anything about the new digital evidence portal or the captain's tie or the smell coming from the break room microwave. He sat upright, opened a case folder, and began reading. Marcus watched him over the rim of his cup. 2 days they had been working the Claire Hensley murder. 2 days of lab reports trickling in, witness canvases returning nothing, the precinct humming with the particular restless energy that settled over homicide when a pattern case went active. And for 2 days, Ray had been quieter than Marcus had ever known him. Not withdrawn, not cold, just precise. Every word delivered with the economy of a man rationing something he could not afford to waste. "How'd you sleep?" Ray asked without looking up. "Fine. Dreams?" Marcus paused with the cup halfway to his mouth. It was not the kind of question Ray asked. Ray asked about cases, about evidence, about whether you'd eaten and when you'd last been to the range. He did not ask about dreams. "Nothing memorable," Marcus said. "Good." Ray turned a page. "Your follow-up with the neurologist, that's still 3 weeks out?" "About that. 2.5 now." "You keeping up with the journal, the symptom thing?" "When there's something to write." Ray nodded slowly, still reading, or pretending to read. His eyes were not tracking across the page in the way eyes do when absorbing information. They were fixed at a single point near the center of the document, unfocused, the way a man stares when his mind is somewhere else entirely. "I pulled your medical clearance file yesterday," Ray said. "Just wanted to make sure the paperwork was clean for the captain's review." It was a reasonable thing to say. It was the kind of thing a senior detective did for his partner, especially a partner returning from a catastrophic injury. But the timing was wrong. The captain's review had been completed before Marcus's first day back. Ray knew that because Ray had been the one to walk Marcus through the results. "Everything look okay?" Marcus asked. "Mostly. The neurologist's notes mention that transplant-related symptoms should diminish over the first 6 months, frequency decreasing, intensity fading." Ray paused. He looked up for the first time. His dark eyes were steady, ringed with their permanent fatigue, but something behind them had sharpened. "The visions you're having, are they fading?" The precinct noise filled the silence between them. Someone laughed near the coffee station. A phone rang 4 desks away and was answered on the 3rd ring. The overhead fluorescents hummed their insect drone. Marcus could feel the scar along his temple, a thin line of heat beneath the skin. "Some days are clearer than others," he said. "That's not what I asked." Marcus set his coffee down. The cup made a small, definitive sound against the wood. "They're not fading. If anything, they're getting more detailed." Ray absorbed this. His expression did not change, which was itself a change. The old Ray, the Ray from before, would have made a crack about it. Something dry and profane, a joke that landed just hard enough to break the tension. That Ray had not shown up for work in 2 days. "More detailed," Ray repeated. "And more frequent?" "I wouldn't say frequent. A few since I've been back." "How many is a few?" Marcus heard the structure of the questions. He recognized it the way any detective recognizes interview technique. The open-ended lead followed by the specific probe, the gentle repetition designed to pin a subject's language before they could revise it. Ray was interviewing him. Not aggressively, not even consciously perhaps. The way a man who has spent 20 years in rooms with liars begins to do it by reflex, the muscle memory of suspicion firing before the conscious mind grants permission. 3, maybe 4. Marcus kept his voice level. The one the night before the Hensley scene, one during the scene itself, a couple of fragments since then. The one the night before. That was the 9/17 entry in your journal? Marcus looked at him. "You told me about it at the scene," Ray said. "The timing. You said you'd written it down." "Right, yeah, 9/17. And the estimated time of death was between 10 and 2. That's what the lab said." Ray nodded again. That slow, deliberate nod that could mean agreement, or could mean he was filing something away for later. His thumb found the thick scar on his left knuckle and pressed, a gesture Marcus had seen 1,000 times. But the pressure was different now, harder, sustained, the skin whitening around the edges. "The transplant explanation," Ray said. "Perry's tissue encoding experiences surfacing in your brain. I've been thinking about that." "Okay." "If the tissue retained Perry's memories, those memories would be from before his death, before the confrontation, before the surgery." "That's the theory." "So any vision you experience through that mechanism would correspond to something Perry saw or did while he was alive." "In theory." "The Hensley murder happened 6 months after Perry died." The sentence sat between them like a stone dropped into still water. Marcus watched the ripples spread through Ray's expression. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would register to anyone watching from across the bullpen. But Marcus was not anyone. He was the person who knew this man's face better than almost any other. He saw the slight tightening around the jaw, the way Ray's blink rate slowed, as though he was being very careful about what his eyes revealed. "I know," Marcus said. "I've thought about that." "And?" "The neurologist says there's no established framework for any of this. Transplant memory isn't proven. It's speculative. Maybe the mechanism doesn't work the way we're assuming. Maybe proximity to similar stimuli is triggering associative recall that feels like Perry's perspective, but is actually my own subconscious processing." He heard himself say it. He heard how smoothly it came out, how the words arranged themselves into something that sounded almost medical, almost clinical, almost believable. And he heard, beneath the words, the hollow ring of a structure that had been assembled to hold weight it was never designed to bear. Ray heard it too. Marcus could tell by the way his partner's gaze held for one beat too long before releasing. "Associative recall," Ray said. "That's one possibility. That's a pretty good possibility." Ray's voice was soft, almost gentle, which was worse than any sharpness would have been, because gentleness from Ray Castillo meant he was handling something fragile, and the fragile thing was Marcus. "I'm sure the neurologist will have more to say about it at the follow-up." He looked back down at his file. The conversation was over, but the air between their desks had changed composition, thickened with something neither of them would name. Marcus picked up his coffee and drank. It was the right temperature, 2 sugars, no cream. Ray had remembered, as he always remembered, because caring about someone and investigating them were not mutually exclusive activities, and Ray Castillo was learning to do both at once. 10 minutes later, Marcus went to the bathroom. When he came back, Ray was gone. Not from the bullpen, but from his chair. Marcus found him in the hallway outside the men's room on the way back, standing alone between the vending machines and the fire exit. He was pressing his right palm flat against the wall, fingers spread, his full weight leaning into the drywall as though the building might move if he did not hold it in place. His eyes were closed. His breathing was controlled and deliberate, in the way breathing becomes when a person is managing something physical: pain, nausea, the particular vertigo of watching a thing you love become a thing you fear. Marcus stopped. He stood 15 feet away, close enough to see the tension in Ray's shoulders, the way his scarred knuckle whitened against the wall, the faint tremor running through his forearm. Far enough that Ray had not heard him. He turned around and walked back to his desk the long way, through the conference room corridor, so Ray would not know he had seen. The morning passed. They worked in parallel silence, reviewing forensic reports, running background checks on Claire Hensley's co-workers and neighbors, and the people who rented other storage units in the complex off Maddox. The leads were thin and growing thinner. Claire Hensley had no connection to the previous 5 victims beyond living in the same city. No criminal record, no known enemies, no overlapping social circles with Nolan Perry. She was random, which meant the killer selected by criteria invisible to anyone outside his own mind. Marcus was deep in a database search when his phone buzzed, a text from Elena Marsh. He read it twice, then told Ray he was stepping out to follow up with the victim advocate on the Hensley family status. "Go ahead," Ray said without looking up. Elena was waiting in the small conference room adjacent to the bullpen, the one with a window that looked out onto the parking structure and the ventilation ducts. She had the door half open and a cardboard file box on the table, and when Marcus came in, she was already pulling documents out of it with the focused, almost hungry energy of someone who had found the thread and was pulling. "Close the door," she said. He did. The sounds of the bullpen dropped to a murmur. "I went back through the material I collected during my time covering the Second Coming cases," Elena said. She was standing, not sitting, her weight shifting between her feet the way it did when her mind was moving faster than the conversation. "I told you I still had Perry's letter and some personal documents. I spent last night going through everything else in the box." She laid a series of photocopied pages across the table. Marcus recognized the formatting of medical records, the narrow columns, the coded abbreviations, the institutional header of a hospital document management system. Mixed among them were printouts from what appeared to be a genetic database, dense rows of alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to him, but clearly meant something to someone trained to read them. And scattered between those were photocopies of birth certificates, or pieces of birth certificates, partial documents with sections obscured by the heavy black bars of institutional redaction. "Perry wasn't collecting trophies," Elena said. "He was building a case." Marcus looked at the documents. He did not touch them. "This is a research file," she continued, tapping the edge of a genetic database printout. "Not a medical study, an investigation." He was cross-referencing genetic records against hospital birth records from a specific date range. He was pulling birth certificates from multiple facilities, but kept coming back to one. She slid a single page toward him. It was a birth record from Mercy General Hospital, or rather the photocopy of one. The hospital's name was printed clearly across the top in the familiar institutional typeface, but significant portions of the document had been redacted, thick black rectangles covering names, parental information, and identifying details. What remained visible was sparse but specific. 2 entries on the same page, logged within minutes of each other. 2 infants, born in adjacent rooms, their timestamps separated by less than an hour. A handwritten notation in the margin, in what appeared to be a nurse's shorthand, referencing an identification band discrepancy that had been flagged for administrative review. Marcus's hands went cold. Not metaphorically. The temperature dropped out of his fingers as though the blood had decided independently to retreat to somewhere safer. He could feel his pulse in his wrists, heavy and slow, and the scar along his temple hummed with the low electric frequency that accompanied moments of pressure. "The redactions are legal department," Elena said. "Hospital counsel blacked out anything that could identify the families. Perry must have gotten the partial through a records request, but whoever processed it stripped it down before releasing." She paused, watching his face with the careful attentiveness that never quite left her expression. The journalist's habit of reading reactions the way a detective reads crime scenes. "Mercy General. That's where you had your surgery." "It's a big hospital," Marcus said. "A lot of people are born there." 2 babies born in adjacent rooms on the same day, with a flagged identification band discrepancy that apparently went to administrative review and then disappeared into the hospital's legal files. She said it evenly, without accusation, stating facts the way she had once stated them in print. Perry was interested in this specific record. He went to considerable effort to obtain it. Marcus stared at the redacted fields. The black rectangles were absolute. No amount of angling the page against the light would reveal what lay beneath them. But the architecture of the document was visible. 2 entries, 2 rooms, 2 infants whose first hours of life had been close enough to create confusion, and whose confusion had been noted and then buried. He felt something move in the deep architecture of his mind. Not a vision, not the doubled perception of the crime scene or the proprietary calm of the 917 experience. Something older and less defined. A subsonic vibration, as though a door far below the surface of his thoughts had been touched by a hand that was not his, or that was his, but belonged to a version of himself he could not access. The feeling had no image attached to it, only the cold in his hands and the certainty, irrational and absolute, that he did not want to know what was under those black rectangles. There's more in the box, Elena said. Genetic database queries, medical journals on hereditary markers, correspondence with a researcher whose name I haven't been able to track down yet. It's organized, chronological. Whatever Perry was doing, he was doing it methodically, and he was doing it for months before the confrontation. The confrontation that killed him. Elena met his eyes. Yes. And you think he was investigating, not killing. I think the letter he wrote to his parents doesn't sound like a man preparing to commit murder. It sounds like a man preparing to expose something. She reached into the box and produced the letter, a single sheet of paper in a clear plastic sleeve. The handwriting was neat, slanting slightly to the right, the penmanship of someone trained to write legibly in medical charts. She did not read it aloud. She did not need to. Marcus had already heard the sentence that mattered. When they see what I've found, they'll know I was trying to help. Elena. He said her name and stopped. He did not know what he had been about to say. His mouth had opened ahead of his thoughts, which was not something that happened to him. His speech was measured, controlled, precise. He chose his words the way a man chooses his steps on uncertain ground. But her name had come out unplanned, propelled by something underneath the calm, and now it hung between them without a sentence attached to it. She waited, patient, the way she had been patient in the parking garage when she showed him her scars, giving him space to fill or leave empty. "This is good work," he said finally. "You should make copies of everything. Keep the originals somewhere safe." "I plan to." She began gathering the documents. Then she paused, her hand resting on the redacted birth record. "Marcus, do you know when you were born? The exact date?" "February 9th. "Do you know which hospital?" The cold in his hands intensified. "My parents told me Mercy General." She looked at the birth record. She looked at him. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The question she was not asking occupied the entire room, pressing against the walls, filling the space between them with a pressure that was almost physical. She slid the birth record into the box with the rest of the documents and put the lid on. "I'll keep digging," she said. "The hospital's legal department might respond to a formal request. Or someone with subpoena authority could compel the unredacted version." Someone with subpoena authority. A detective, she meant. She was giving him the next step and watching to see if he would take it. "I'll mention it to Ray," Marcus said. But he knew, as the words left his mouth, that he would not mention it to Ray. He would not mention the birth record, the adjacent rooms, the flagged identification bands, or the cold in his hands. He would bury it the way the hospital's legal department had buried the discrepancy, beneath a layer of redaction thick enough to obscure the shape of whatever lay beneath. Elena picked up the box. At the door, she turned back. Her hazel eyes moved across his face with that precise cataloging attention that made her so good at her work and so dangerous to anyone with something to hide. "Perry was a medical resident," she said. "He had the training to read genetic markers, the access to pull hospital records, and the analytical mind to build an investigation. He also died before he could share what he found with anyone who could act on it." She held the box against her hip. "That letter bothers me, Marcus. It has bothered me for months. What did he find?" She left. The conference room door closed behind her. Marcus stood alone in the small room with the window that looked out onto concrete ducts and the gray wall of the parking structure, and he pressed his palms flat on the table and leaned his weight into them until his wrists ached. The cold was not leaving his hands. It had moved up his forearms, past his elbows, into his chest, settling around his heart like a casing. He did not follow the thought. He could feel it, waiting, the way you feel a shape in dark water, not seeing it, but knowing by the displacement of everything around it that something large is there. He pressed harder against the table. He breathed. He let the thought sink back down. He returned to his desk. Ray was there, reading again, or pretending to read. Neither of them spoke. The afternoon accumulated in small increments of work and silence, and by 5:30 the bullpen had thinned to its evening skeleton, the night shift trickling in, the day shift collecting coats and bags and moving toward the doors in the slow current of institutional routine. Marcus was packing his messenger bag when Ray appeared beside his desk. Jacket on, tie loosened to the second button, keys in hand. "Walk out together?" Ray said. They moved through the bullpen and down the concrete stairwell into the parking garage. Second level. The air smelled of exhaust and old oil, and the draft that always funneled between the parked cars carried the metallic taste of cold concrete. Their footsteps echoed in counterpoint, Marcus's even stride, Ray's slightly heavier, slightly slower. "I did something today," Ray said. His voice was conversational, easy. The voice of a man sharing an idle thought on his way to his car. "Mapped your vision dates against Perry's confirmed movements. His medical school records, rotation schedules, the timeline the prosecution built for the Second Coming case. Cross-referenced everything." Marcus's pulse thickened. He kept walking. "Yeah?" "Most of it lines up well enough. Perry was in the city during the relevant windows, had access, the whole picture the prosecution painted." Ray's keys jingled as he shifted them from one hand to the other. "But a couple don't match. There's at least one date where one of your visions corresponds to a period when Perry was confirmed at an out-of-state conference. Hospital records, airline manifests, hotel check-in. He wasn't here." They had reached Marcus's car. He stopped. Ray stopped beside him. The garage's overhead light buzzed and flickered, casting their shadows in unsteady intervals. "Has the neurologist said anything about cross-contamination?" Ray asked. "Like, could your own memories be blending with Perry's tissue and creating composite impressions? Something that feels like one clear memory but is actually stitched together from multiple sources?" It was a generous question. It offered Marcus an exit, a medical explanation that could absorb the discrepancy and fold it back into the framework of transplanted tissue and residual encoding. Ray was giving him one more chance to make the story work. Marcus laughed. The sound came out of him before he could shape it. Quick, bright, a single burst of air that was too loud for the concrete space and carried exactly the wrong frequency. It was not the laugh of a man hearing something mildly interesting. It was the laugh of a man who needed the conversation to be lighter than it was, and it overcompensated so badly that the effort itself became the tell. He heard it. The echo bounced off the garage walls and came back to him, and he heard how wrong it sounded, and he could not retrieve it. Ray heard it too. His face did something Marcus had seen only at crime scenes, the settling, the way all expression drained to neutral, the eyes going flat and watchful. A detective's face. The face you wore when a suspect said the thing that told you everything you needed to know, not by what it meant, but by how it sounded. "Probably something like that," Marcus said. "I'll ask about it at the follow-up." "Good idea." Neither of them moved. The fluorescent light above them buzzed and steadied and buzzed again. Marcus could hear Ray breathing. Slow, even, controlled. The breathing of a man who was managing himself carefully. "Get some rest," Ray said. "You too." Ray turned and walked toward his own car, parked 4 spaces away. Marcus watched him go. The rumpled blazer, the slightly too long gray-black hair, the deliberate economy of a man who had spent 2 decades walking into rooms where bad things happened and walking out again carrying the weight of what he found there. Ray did not look back. He got into his car, started the engine, and pulled out of the space. His taillights flared red in the garage's dim air, then swung around the corner and disappeared down the ramp. Marcus stood beside his car. His keys were in his right hand. His left hand was shaking. Not trembling, shaking. A fine, rapid oscillation that he could see when he held it up in the unsteady light. He pressed it flat against the roof of the car and held it there until the metal's cold seeped into his palm and the shaking slowed. He had heard himself laugh. He had heard the wrong note in it, the desperate brightness, the frequency of a man deflecting something he could not face. And worse than hearing it was the knowledge that Ray had heard it too, and that Ray's face had done the thing it did in interview rooms, and that the relationship that had once been the steadiest thing in Marcus's life was now the thing he feared most. Because Ray was not going to stop mapping dates. Ray was not going to stop asking questions. Ray was going to keep doing what good detectives did, which was follow the evidence wherever it led, even when wherever it led was somewhere he did not want to go. Elena's voice surfaced in his memory. Not the things she had said today about birth records and redactions and Nolan Perry's organized research. The things she had said in the parking garage the day before, when she showed him her scars and told him what she believed. Identity isn't what's inside your skull. It's what you choose to do with it. He had carried that sentence like a talisman. He had held it close, turned it over, let its warmth reassure him that the visions and the gaps and the residue under his nails were medical curiosities, not confessions. That whatever Perry's tissue was doing inside his brain, Marcus was still Marcus. The choices were still his. But sitting in his car now, with the engine off and the garage emptying around him and the taste of his own wrong laugh still metallic in his mouth, the sentence had changed shape. The warmth was gone. What remained was the structure of the words, and the structure was not comfort. It was accusation. Because if identity was what you chose to do, then the things Marcus was choosing, the silence, the scrubbed fingernails, the birth record he would not mention, the journal left deliberately in his bedside drawer, those choices were also his identity. And those choices did not belong to a good man recovering from trauma. Those choices belonged to someone hiding. He started the car. He drove home. He remembered every second of the drive, which should have been reassuring but was not, because the memory felt monitored, as though some part of him was watching to make sure no time went missing this time. And the fact that part of him needed to watch meant there was something to watch for. In his apartment, he stood at the kitchen sink and washed his hands. The water was too hot. He let it burn. He checked under each fingernail individually, methodically, the way he had checked the night before when he found the dark, brownish-red residue. Tonight, there was nothing. His nails were clean. His hands were his hands. He dried them on the towel hanging from the oven handle and sat down at the kitchen table. The manila folder was where he had left it. Claire Hensley's preliminary intake sheet, the next of kin form, the driver's license photocopy, the crime scene photographs and forensic report. He opened it. He began reviewing the photographs again, one by one, laying them out in a grid across the table's surface. Claire Hensley on the concrete floor of Unit 17. Hands placed palms up, fingers slightly curled, clothing undisturbed. The thin, dark line of the ligature mark circling her throat. He studied the photographs the way he always studied crime scene photographs. Carefully, systematically, looking for the thing everyone else had missed. But tonight, as his gaze moved across the images, he felt the doubled vision pressing at the edges of his perception again. The storage unit seen from outside, through his detective's eyes, and the storage unit seen from inside, through the calm, proprietary perspective that knew where the work lamp had been placed and why. 2 layers of the same image, 2 sets of eyes looking at the same dead woman. And the terrible thing, the thing that made his hands go still on the table's surface, was that the inside perspective was more familiar. He closed the folder. He put the photographs away. He went to bed. He did not open the symptom journal in his bedside drawer. There was nothing he wanted to write, because writing required naming, and naming required acknowledging, and acknowledging would collapse the last thin wall between the story he was telling himself and whatever waited on the other side. The apartment settled around him, pipes ticking in the walls, the muffled drone of a television from the unit below, the building breathing its old mechanical breath. Somewhere across the city, Ray Castillo was sitting at his kitchen table with a drugstore composition book open in front of him, adding a new entry in his compressed, slanting handwriting. And somewhere else, Elena Marsh was sitting on the floor of her apartment with a cardboard box of Nolan Perry's research spread around her, reading a dead man's meticulous notes and following the thread he had dyed before he could finish pulling. Both of them were moving towards something Marcus could feel approaching the way you feel weather change, a pressure shift, a darkening at the edge of vision, the air going heavy with what it is about to carry. He lay in the dark and listened to his own breathing and told himself that tomorrow would bring clarity, that the neurologist would have answers, that the dates would line up if someone looked at them the right way, that the birth record was a coincidence, and the cold in his hands was fatigue, and the wrong laugh was just a bad moment in a hard week. He told himself these things, and beneath the telling, in the deep architecture where thought became something older than language, he felt the door he would not open pressing against its frame. And he understood, not in words, not in anything he could record in a journal or explain to a partner, that the door was not locked from the outside. It was locked from within, and the hand on the bolt was his. Chapter 4. The Visit. The decision to visit Edward Brandt had formed the way ice forms on a windshield. Not all at once, but in a slow crystalline spread, so that by the time Marcus noticed it, the entire surface was covered, and he could no longer see through to whatever had been there before. He told himself the reason was professional. The new murder matched the second coming pattern. The second coming pattern derived from the headhunter's original signature. If you wanted to understand a derivative, you went to the source. It was the kind of reasoning that sounded clean in his head, each step following the last with the mechanical precision of a syllogism. And if the conclusion happened to place him in a car driving 200 miles north on a gray Thursday morning toward a maximum security penitentiary, well, that was where the logic led. Ray had not agreed. They'd been standing in the parking garage at the precinct, second level, the overhead fluorescent buzzing its familiar stutter. Ray had his hands in his blazer pockets and his shoulders pulled back, the posture he used when he was trying to seem casual about something that was anything but. Marcus had mentioned the visit the way you mention picking up dry cleaning, slipping it into the gaps between case updates. Ray's face had done something complicated. The muscles around his jaw tightened first, then his eyes, and then a stillness settled over him that Marcus had seen before, not often, and never directed at him. It was the stillness Ray brought into rooms where the news was already bad and getting worse. "You don't need to go in that room," Ray said. "Not shouldn't, not can't. Need. The word carried weight it wasn't supposed to carry, pressed down by something in Ray's voice that Marcus couldn't quite identify. It wasn't anger, though it was close. It wasn't fear. It was the sound of a man standing at the edge of a thing he could see coming and pushing back against it with the only tool he had, which was his voice, which was not enough. "It's a behavioral consult," Marcus said. "The knot technique, the staging evolution, the deviation from Brandt's original pattern. He's the only living person who can speak to the psychology of the signature. The FBI has profilers for that. The FBI profilers didn't grow up in this case. They'll give us a 12-page report in 6 weeks. I can sit across from Brandt for 45 minutes and ask him directly." Ray studied him. The scar across his left knuckle caught the fluorescent light as he pulled one hand from his pocket and pressed his thumb into the raised tissue. The old habit, the self-soothing gesture he probably didn't know he made. Marcus had cataloged it months ago, the way he cataloged everything about his partner. The coffee preference, the tie loosened to the second button, the compressed handwriting, the way silence replaced humor when something mattered. "I can't stop you," Ray said. "There's no procedural basis, and the captain already signed the visitor clearance because I checked." "You checked before I told you?" A pause. Ray's thumb pressed harder into the scar. "I saw you looking up the prison's visiting hours on your phone 2 days ago. Reflection in the break room microwave." He didn't smile. "I'm a detective, Marcus. It's what I do." The sentence sat between them, heavier than it should have been. "Take someone with you," Ray said. "Take me." "You can't be in that room, Sophia." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ray's jaw moved once, a small grinding motion, and then he exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath, the kind you learn when grief is something you carry every day and you've gotten good at distributing the weight so it doesn't show. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Sophia." Neither of them spoke for a moment. Somewhere below them in the garage, a car door closed and an engine turned over, the sound reverberating through concrete. "Be careful," Ray said. And then, as though he couldn't help one more attempt, one more push against the thing he could feel approaching. "Whatever he tells you, remember, he's had 20 years to prepare for a conversation like this. You haven't had 20 minutes." Marcus had nodded. He'd clapped Ray on the shoulder, a mirror of the gesture Ray had given him on his first day back. The 3-beat grip, checking you're real. Ray's expression hadn't changed. His eyes had stayed on Marcus as Marcus walked to his car. And when Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror pulling out of the garage, Ray was still standing there, hands back in his pockets, watching him go. That had been 4 hours ago. Now Marcus sat in a molded plastic chair bolted to the floor of a reinforced visiting room that smelled of industrial disinfectant, and something underneath it, something old and human that no amount of chemical could reach. The room was divided by a metal table, also bolted down, with a single chair on each side. Overhead, a strip light hummed at a frequency just below conscious perception, the kind of ambient noise that crawled into your teeth if you sat with it long enough. The walls were painted the color of old putty. A corrections officer stood near the door, hands clasped in front of him, his face professionally empty. Marcus noticed his own heartbeat and was annoyed by how fast it was. 70-something at rest was his normal. This was closer to 90. He could feel it in his throat and the soft tissue behind his ears. He told himself it was the drive, the coffee he'd grabbed at a gas station 30 miles south of the facility, the particular discomfort of submitting to a security screening that included a wand sweep and a pat-down and a series of questions about whether he was carrying any weapons, recording devices, or medication. He told himself it was professional alertness, preparation. His right wrist was rotating, the small, rhythmic movement, a clockwise turn of the joint, barely perceptible, the kind of thing that happened below the threshold of awareness, the way breathing happened. He didn't notice it. He had never noticed it. It was as invisible to him as the color of his own eyes. A door on the far side of the room opened with a heavy mechanical click. Edward Brandt entered the way weather enters a room. Not with force, but with a shift in pressure that changed everything already present. He was thinner than his photograph suggested, or perhaps the photographs had been taken when he was still a surgeon who ate his own reportedly excellent risotto. The institutional living had pared him down to essentials. Silver hair kept meticulously neat, combed back from a high forehead, with the kind of precision that spoke of a man who had nothing but time and had chosen to invest it in the details he could still control. A gaunt face with good bones beneath it, and his eyes, pale blue, the color of winter sky through a frosted window, which found Marcus and settled on him with the composed attention of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment and was not surprised that it had finally arrived. He wore a standard-issue jumpsuit and moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned to make small spaces feel large. His hands were folded in front of him as the corrections officer escorted him to the opposite chair. Large hands, a surgeon's hands. The fingers were long and precise, and they settled into his lap with a calm that suggested they had never done anything uncontrolled in their existence. Detective Cole? Edward's voice was exactly what the trial transcript suggested, and nothing like what Marcus had imagined. Soft, measured, warm in the way that a well-tuned instrument is warm, the resonance coming from craftsmanship rather than feeling. "Thank you for the visit. I don't get many." "I appreciate you agreeing to see me," Marcus said. His own voice sounded too loud in the room, too young. He pulled his notebook from his jacket pocket, the professional prop, the investigator's shield. "I'm working an active case. New homicide with staging elements that echo your original pattern. The department thought a behavioral consultation might—" "The department thought? Or you thought?" Marcus paused. Edward had tilted his head slightly, the way a bird does when it's listening to something beneath the surface of a sound. "I requested the visit," Marcus said. "The department approved it." "Good. I prefer honesty in small things." Edward unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table, palms down, fingers spread, a gesture of openness that felt rehearsed and genuine at the same time. "Tell me about the staging." Marcus walked him through the broad strokes, the Hensley scene, the positioning of the body, the ligature technique, the unlocked door. He kept his language clinical, his tone neutral, his eyes on his notebook. He did not mention the doubled vision. He did not mention the inside perspective. He presented the case the way any detective would present it to any consultant. Clean, organized, stripped of the personal. Edward listened with the absolute attention of a man for whom listening was a diagnostic act. He did not interrupt. He did not nod. He did not make the small, encouraging sounds that people make in conversation to signal that they are following along. He simply watched Marcus speak with those pale blue eyes that did not blink at the expected intervals, and when Marcus finished, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was the silence of someone processing not the words, but the person delivering them. "The knot technique is interesting," Edward said. "A double-column restraint with a locking hitch isn't something you learn from a manual. It requires practice, repetition. The hands have to know the motion before the mind can think about it." He paused. "Like surgery. Were you familiar with that particular technique?" "I was a surgeon, detective. I used a different set of tools." A faint smile. "But the principle is the same. Precision is a habit, not a decision. You either have the hands for it, or you don't. Marcus wrote this down. The pen felt strange in his grip, too light, too smooth, as though it belonged to someone else. What about the deviation from your original pattern? The head stays on. That's significant. Significant to whom? To the investigation, to the profile. Edward leaned back slightly. His posture remained perfect. Shoulders level, spine straight, the kind of stillness that should have looked rigid, but instead looked entirely natural, as though he had been poured into that shape, and the shape had set. "May I ask you something personal, Detective?" The shift was seamless. One moment they were discussing staging patterns, and the next, Edward was looking at him with an interest that had nothing to do with the case file, and everything to do with something Marcus could feel pressing against the inside of his chest. "That depends on the question," Marcus said. "When did you start sleeping badly?" Marcus's pen stopped moving. "I'm not—" "The circles under your eyes are new. The skin is darker along the orbital bone than it would be from simple fatigue. That's cumulative sleep disruption. Weeks, not days. And you're holding your pen in your left hand, that the callus pattern on your right index finger suggests you're naturally right-handed. You've switched without knowing it. People do that when their dominant hand has been busy with something they don't want to remember." Edward said this the way he might have said, "It's raining outside." An observation. Casual, almost kind. "Do you dream?" "Everyone dreams." "That's not what I asked." Marcus closed his notebook. The motion was deliberate, a professional signal that a boundary had been reached. "We're here to discuss the case, Mr. Brandt." "Of course." Edward's tone was conciliatory, gentle. The tone of a doctor who has pushed a patient further than they were ready to go and knows exactly when to step back. "Tell me about the victims, the selection criteria. That's where the real architecture lives." They talked for another 15 minutes about victimology, about the randomness of the selections, about the absence of connective tissue between the dead. Edward offered observations that were precise and useful, clinical insights about the psychology of apparently random selection that would genuinely help the investigation. He spoke about pattern and compulsion the way a musicologist might speak about composition, with admiration, with structural understanding, with an intimacy that came from living inside the work rather than observing it from outside. And then he did the thing that changed everything. Marcus had asked a question about escalation, whether the deviation from the original headhunter's decapitation pattern suggested a less committed killer or a more controlled one. As he spoke, his right hand rested on the table, and his wrist turned in that small, clockwise motion, the rotation so habitual and invisible that it was like the ticking of a clock you've stopped hearing because it has always been there. Edward's eyes moved to Marcus's wrist. The shift was tiny, a micro-adjustment of focus, a narrowing of attention so slight that someone who wasn't watching Edward's face at that exact moment would have missed it entirely. But Marcus was watching, because some part of him, the part that had survived 6 months of visions and residue under fingernails and missing time and a birth record with 2 infants born an hour apart, that part was watching everything now, all the time, the way a man watches the water when he knows there is something beneath the surface. Edward's pale blue eyes fixed on the rotating wrist, and into those eyes came something that Marcus had not expected and did not know how to process. Recognition. Not the recognition of one stranger identifying a gesture in another. Something deeper. Something that started in the eyes and spread through the muscles of Edward's face like sunrise spreading across a landscape. Slow, warm, irreversible. Satisfaction. And beneath the satisfaction, something worse, something that looked impossibly, horribly, like love. "My son used to do that," Edward said. The sentence was quiet, almost tender, delivered with the careful precision of a man placing a single stone on a scale and watching the balance shift. Marcus's wrist stopped moving. "Your son," he said. His voice was steady. He was amazed by how steady it was. "Nolan Perry." Edward smiled. The smile was gentle. It was patient. It carried the weight of years, of waiting, of certainty, of a knowledge held so long and so quietly that it had become part of the architecture of the man holding it. Edward's hands remained flat on the table. His posture did not change. His pale blue eyes rested on Marcus with an expression that was, in its own terrible way, the most peaceful thing Marcus had ever seen on a human face. He said nothing. The silence expanded. It filled the visiting room the way water fills a vessel, completely, without gaps, pressing against every surface. The strip light hummed. The corrections officer shifted his weight. Somewhere deeper in the prison, a door clanged shut, the sound traveling through concrete and metal and arriving diminished but present, like an echo from another world. Marcus waited for Edward to correct himself, to clarify, to say, "Yes, Nolan Perry. The boy they told me was mine." He waited for the sentence to complete itself into something that made sense inside the framework he had built. The framework of neural tissue and residual memory, and a dead man's patterns surfacing through borrowed cells. Edward said nothing. The smile remained. "Your son was Nolan Perry," Marcus said again, insisting now, the repetition sounding, even to his own ears, like something other than a correction, like a plea. "I've enjoyed this conversation very much, Detective Cole," Edward said. He folded his hands in his lap. The gesture was final. The consultation was over, not because time had run out, but because Edward had accomplished what he intended and saw no reason to continue. "You carry yourself well. Your composure is admirable. I hope you'll visit again." Marcus gathered his notebook. He stood. His legs felt distant from the rest of him, as though the signal traveling from his brain to his muscles was taking slightly too long to arrive. He reached the door and the corrections officer opened it, and as Marcus stepped through, he heard Edward's voice one more time, soft, almost offhand, delivered to his retreating back. "The dreams will get clearer. Don't be frightened of them." The corrections officer closed the door. Marcus walked through the security checkpoints. He submitted to the exit screening. He collected his phone and his keys from the plastic tray and signed the visitor's log and walked through 2 sets of reinforced doors that opened one at a time with that heavy mechanical click, each one sealing shut behind him before the next one opened. A system designed to ensure that no one who was inside could follow someone who was leaving. He crossed the parking lot. The afternoon was gray and cold, the kind of weather that couldn't decide between rain and not rain, and had settled for a damp heaviness that clung to skin and clothing. His car was where he'd left it, 4th row, 3rd from the end. He got in. He put his hands on the steering wheel. He did not start the engine. Edward's voice played back in fragments, each one landing in a different place. "My son used to do that. The dreams will get clearer. Precision is a habit, not a decision. You either have the hands for it or you don't." And the smile that was patient and gentle and certain, and carried within it the quiet, devastating weight of a man who had been waiting for something for a very long time, and had just watched it walk through his door. The vision came without warning. It rose through him the way the others had risen, not from outside, not from memory or imagination, but from somewhere beneath both, a place that had no name and no address, and existed in the deep architecture of his mind, where thought became something older than language. But this one was different. This one was more. He was in a room. Dim. The smell of dust and something chemical. Cleaning solution. Industrial grade, the kind that burned the back of the throat. There was a body on the floor. Staged. Hands palms up, fingers slightly curled. The work lamp casting its cone of white light. The ligature mark, thin and precise, a dark circlet around the throat, like a piece of jewelry placed with care. He looked down. The hands in the vision were holding something, a length of cord, already coiled, already finished. And the hands were not abstract. They were not the blurred, unidentifiable hands he had seen in every vision before this one, hands he had attributed to Nolan Perry, because the alternative was not something he could afford to consider. These hands had a scar. A thin surgical scar running along the left temple, visible in the reflection of a window to his right. A dark window, nighttime, acting as a mirror. The reflection showed his face, his hair, his calm brown eyes looking back at him with an expression that was not horror, not revulsion, not any of the things a person should feel when standing over a body they have made. The expression was calm. He gasped, and the vision shattered. He was back in the car, hands on the steering wheel, the parking lot gray and damp around him. His breath came fast and uneven, the sound of it filling the interior of the car like something trying to escape. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking, both of them. His right wrist was rotating. The small clockwise motion. The gesture Edward Brandt had watched with recognition and satisfaction, and something that looked like love. Marcus stared at his own wrist as it turned, and for a single unbearable second, the glass wall between himself and the man he had just visited dissolved entirely. Not cracked, not chipped, but gone, as though it had never existed. As though the separation between Marcus Cole and Edward Brandt was something that had been constructed rather than something that was real, and the construction had just failed. He stopped the rotation with his left hand. He gripped his own wrist and held it still, the way you hold a wound to stop the bleeding. The vision was distortion. Edward Brandt was a manipulative psychopath who had planted suggestions designed to destabilize. The wrist rotation was coincidence, a common self-soothing gesture, nothing more. The reflection in the vision's window was his subconscious inserting his own image into Perry's memory because proximity to Brandt had triggered a stress response that contaminated the neural graft's output. He constructed this explanation carefully, each piece fitted to the next with the precision of a man building a wall against water. And he knew, with a clarity that sat in his chest like a cold stone, that it did not hold. That it was the weakest thing he had ever built, that the seams were visible and the mortar was wet, and the water was already finding the gaps. He started the engine. He drove south, 200 miles of highway unspooling beneath the tires, the landscape flat and gray, the kind of terrain that offered nothing for the eye to hold on to, and therefore left the mind nowhere to hide. He passed the gas station where he'd bought coffee on the way up. He passed the exit for a town whose name he didn't read. He merged onto the interstate and set his speed at 67 miles per hour and held it there with the mechanical precision of a man who needed to control something, anything, even if it was only the needle on a dashboard gauge. His internal narration went quiet. Not the composed quiet of a man choosing his words carefully. Not the strategic silence of someone marshalling an argument. This was different. This was absence. The voice that had been running inside his head since he was old enough to think in sentences, the voice that rationalized and explained and constructed frameworks and told him stories about who he was and what things meant, that voice had stopped. It had been running so long and so constantly that its presence had become invisible. the way the hum of a refrigerator becomes invisible until the power goes out, and the silence that replaces it is so total and so sudden that you realize you have never actually heard silence before. This was that silence. The highway stretched ahead. The wipers swept once, twice, clearing a mist that was not quite rain. His hands held the wheel at 10 and 2. His face, reflected faintly in the windshield glass, showed nothing. Not composure, not distress, not the careful blankness of someone hiding what they feel. Just nothing. A face emptied of its internal tenant, the lights on, but nobody at the window. He drove for 200 miles without turning on the radio, without adjusting the climate control, without reaching for his phone. The only sound was the engine and the tires and the wipers and his own breathing, steady and even. The breathing of a man whose body had decided to keep functioning, even though the thing that animated it had gone somewhere else. When he pulled into his parking spot at the apartment building, the same spot, the same building, the same cracked concrete he had walked across hundreds of times, he turned off the engine and sat in the dark for 7 minutes. He counted them. Counting felt like something he could still do, a mechanical act that required no interpretation, no narrative, no self. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He went upstairs. He unlocked his door. He hung his jacket on the hook. He stood in his kitchen and looked at the counter and the sink and the dish brush and the towel hanging from the oven handle, and everything was exactly where he had left it that morning. And everything was different. And the difference was not in the objects, but in the person looking at them. His phone, left on the counter, showed a voicemail. The notification light blinked green in the dim kitchen, a small, insistent pulse. He pressed play. Elena's voice filled the apartment, warm, casual, the voice of someone calling from a world where things still made sense, where a phone call was just a phone call, where coffee was just coffee, where the person you were calling was the person you believed them to be. "Hey, it's me. I found something else in Perry's files. I think I'm getting close to whatever he was trying to put together. Want to grab coffee tomorrow and I'll walk you through it? Nothing urgent, just I keep thinking about that birth record, and I keep thinking about what he wrote to his parents. Anyway, call me back when you get a chance. I hope you had a good day." The voicemail ended. The apartment was quiet. The pipes ticked. The television droned below. Marcus stood in his kitchen with Elena's voice still ringing in the silence where his own voice used to be, and he did not move. And he did not think, and the green light on his phone blinked on and off and on and off, like a heartbeat he could see, but could not feel. Chapter 5. The Trophy. He did not sleep. He did not try. He stood in his kitchen until the green light on his phone stopped blinking, the voicemail saved and filed by the system's automatic protocol, and then he moved to the couch and sat with his hands on his knees and waited for something. He was not sure what. Morning, perhaps. A feeling. A thought that made sense. None of these arrived on any particular schedule, so he sat and listened to the pipes tick and the television murmur through the floor and the sound of his own breathing, which continued without his permission or participation, steady as a metronome set by someone who had left the room. At some point the light changed. Gray crept through the blinds. His phone rang at 6:22, and it was Ray. "We've got another one." Marcus closed his eyes. Behind them, in the space where his thoughts used to narrate themselves, there was only a vast, ringing quiet. He opened his eyes. "Where?" "You know the parking structure on Devlin, east side? 4th level. Open air. Groundskeeper found her 40 minutes ago. A pause. The sound of Ray breathing. And beneath it, the sound of Ray choosing his next words with the care of a man diffusing ordnance. Marcus? The victim is Karen Loomis. The name meant something. It took Marcus 2 full seconds to retrieve why. And in those 2 seconds, his body did something his mind did not authorize. His right wrist rotated, a small clockwise motion, smooth and habitual and invisible to him as the color of his own eyes. "She's one of De Silva's techs," he said. She was. Karen Loomis, crime scene technician, forensic division. 36. Quiet, efficient, steady hands. She had processed the secondary fiber evidence from Claire Hensley's crime scene. She had bagged the ligature impressions and labeled them with a felt-tipped marker in handwriting so precise it looked printed. Marcus knew this because he had watched her do it. He had stood 6 feet away in Unit 17 and watched her gloved fingers work, and he had felt nothing in particular. And now she was dead on the 4th level of a parking structure on Devlin Street, and he still felt nothing in particular. And the absence of feeling was the thing that should have told him everything. "I'm on my way," he said. He dressed in 4 minutes. He drove 11. He remembered every second. The parking structure was a brutalist concrete rectangle that the city had built in the 80s and never loved enough to maintain. Cracks ran through the support columns like veins. The 4th level was open to the sky, ringed by a waist-high barrier wall, and the morning air carried the smell of exhaust and wet concrete, and something else that Marcus recognized before he stepped out of his car. Copper. Faint beneath the wind, but there. Ray was already at the scene. He stood with his hands in his pockets and his tie loosened to the 2nd button, and his face arranged in the expression Marcus had learned to read as operational grief. The look Ray wore when the work required him to feel nothing, and the feeling he was suppressing required all of his weight to hold down. De Silva was there too, moving with a precision that had calcified into something harder than professionalism. One of her people was on the concrete. She was processing the scene anyway. Her hands did not shake. Her jaw was set so tight the muscles in her temples stood out like cables. The body was centered on the open 4th level, equidistant from the barrier walls. Hands placed palms up at the sides, fingers slightly curled. Clothing undisturbed. A thin, precise ligature mark circled the throat like a necklace placed with surgical care. Head intact. The staging was identical. It was always identical. The pattern replicated itself with the fidelity of a biological process, like cell division, like inheritance. Marcus stood at the perimeter tape, and the doubled vision hit him like a door swinging open. He saw the 4th level from where he stood. Gray morning light, forensic markers, De Silva's team in their gloves and booties. And he saw it from inside. Nighttime. The city spread below the barrier wall. Sodium orange streetlights, the hum of a transformer somewhere in the structure's guts. The work lamp positioned exactly where he knew it would be before his eyes found it. 38 inches from the body's left shoulder, angled to illuminate the throat. 1 inch farther than the Hensley scene. A deliberate adjustment. He knew why. The concrete here was lighter, more reflective. The lamp needed to be pulled back to avoid washing out the shadow detail along the jaw. He knew this the way he knew how to breathe. "The lamp distance changed," he said. His voice came out flat and professional and perfectly controlled, because the thing that controlled it was not the thing that felt. "Check the angle." She positioned the body to account for the surface albedo. "The concrete here is lighter than the storage unit. The shadow work matters to him." De Silva looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her voice was steady. "That's consistent with what I'm seeing. How did you know?" "Perry's tissue," Marcus said. The words came automatically. A recording of a recording. A copy so many generations removed from the original that the fidelity had degraded into something that sounded like truth only if you did not listen carefully. The procedural memory encoding. Same mechanism as the knot pattern. De Silva nodded and returned to her work. She did not have the bandwidth to question it today. Her colleague was on the ground. Ray said nothing. He stood 4 feet to Marcus's left and watched him with an expression that was not suspicion and not grief and not anger, but some alloy of all three that had no name in English. Marcus felt Ray's attention on the side of his face like heat from an open flame. The briefing happened at 11. Marcus provided 2 additional details that the forensic team confirmed within the hour. The specific gauge of the ligature cord, which he described as narrower than the Hensley scene by roughly a millimeter, and the direction of the drag marks on Karen Loomis's heels, which indicated she had been moved from a vehicle parked in the northeast corner of the 4th level. Both details proved accurate. The room murmured with a mixture of admiration and unease that had become the ambient texture of Marcus's professional life. He was the investigation's most valuable asset. He was the man who could see what no one else could see. The precinct needed him the way a body needs a fever, useful, necessary, and dangerous if it continued too long. After the briefing, Marcus walked back toward the bullpen. He turned the corner past the vending machines and stopped. Ray was at his desk. His left hand rested on the open page of a composition notebook, the cheap drugstore kind with the mottled black and white cover. His right hand held a pen, paused mid-stroke, and on the page, visible from 12 feet away because Ray's handwriting was large and blunt and had never learned to be small, Marcus saw his own name. Marcus Cole, underlined twice. Below it, in the same heavy hand, a column of dates, a column of details, a column of sources. The architecture of a case file, rendered in the personal shorthand of a man who had spent 20 years building cases against people he was paid to catch. Ray looked up. Their eyes met across the bullpen, across the desks and monitors and coffee cups and the ordinary machinery of a place where people came to find the truth. Marcus saw Ray's hand move, not quickly but deliberately, closing the notebook. The cover settled with a soft sound that traveled the length of the room. Neither of them spoke. Marcus held Ray's gaze for 3 seconds. 4. 5. He watched something pass across Ray's face that he recognized from the prison visiting room, from the moment Edward Brandt had said, "My son used to do that." And the air between them had changed temperature. It was the look of a man who knows a thing he cannot unknow, and is calculating the cost of that knowledge in units more personal than evidence. Ray's eyes moved, not to Marcus, not to the notebook, to the corner of his desk, where Sophia's photograph sat in its silver frame. Sophia at 22, dark hair in motion, features that echoed her brother's, laughing at something the camera didn't capture. Ray looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he reached out with his scarred left hand and laid the frame face down on the desk. The back of the frame was gray felt, slightly dusty. It looked like a small, empty altar. He could not look at her and do what he had to do next. Marcus turned and walked to the parking garage. He descended the concrete stairs to the 2nd level, got in his car, and sat behind the wheel with the engine off. His hands were at 10 and 2. His wrist was rotating. He watched it rotate for 30 seconds before he gripped it with his left hand and squeezed until the bones ground together and the motion stopped. His name, underlined twice. He drove home. He remembered every second. The apartment was dark. He did not turn on the lights. He moved through the kitchen and the living room and the hallway to his bedroom with the blinds drawn, navigating by the geography of a space he knew down to the centimeter. And he understood as he moved that the knowledge was too precise, too complete, too deep in the architecture of his body rather than his mind. His feet knew where the floorboard creaked. His hand knew the exact pressure required to open the closet door without the hinge squealing. His fingers found the edge of the back panel without searching, without fumbling, without the hesitation of a person encountering something for the first time. The wood was worn smooth where fingers had pressed. Not once, not twice, many times, dozens of times. The wear pattern was the work of months. He pulled the panel free. Behind it, wedged between the wall studs, was a box. Small, wooden, dark-stained, with a hinged lid and a simple brass clasp. The kind of thing you might find at a flea market, unremarkable, designed to hold nothing of importance. He carried it to the bathroom. He sat on the tile floor with his back against the tub and placed the box on the floor between his knees and opened it. A watch. Women's. Silver band, the crystal cracked across the face. He did not recognize it, and then he did, and the recognition came not from memory, but from a deeper channel, a current that ran beneath conscious thought like groundwater beneath a city. Claire Hensley had been wearing a watch in the crime scene photographs. Her sister had mentioned it in the intake interview. This was not that watch. This was the watch Claire Hensley had been wearing before the staging, before the hands placed palms up, before a lock of hair, dark brown, tied with a thin strip of the same cord he had described to De Silva, the same gauge he had identified at the briefing. The cord was tied in a small, neat knot, not a double-column hitch. Something personal, something tender. A driver's license. The laminate was slightly warped, as though it had been handled often. The face on the license was a woman he had seen in case file photographs, one of the 5 original Second Coming victims. A woman named Diane Okafor, whose body had been found in the basement of a rented duplex 11 months ago. The license showed her alive, smiling politely for the camera, and Marcus held it between his thumb and forefinger and felt the faint warmth of the laminate against his skin and understood that his hands had held this object before, many times, in the dark, alone. A ring. Gold, thin band, no stone. He did not know whose it was. He turned it in his fingers and something stirred beneath the surface of his mind, a tremor along a fault line. And he set it down carefully because the tremor carried with it a sensation he could not name and did not want to identify. And at the bottom of the box, a hospital identification badge. Karen Loomis, forensic technician. Her photograph looked up at him with the flat institutional patience of a woman who had not yet become evidence. The badge was new, days old. The lanyard had been cut cleanly, not torn. 5 items, 5 trophies, 5 points of contact between the person who had collected them and the people who had died. Nolan Perry had been dead for 6 months. His neural tissue resided in Marcus's brain, and his neural tissue could not reach into a closet panel and place a wooden box behind the wall studs and visit it so often that the wood wore smooth. Tissue did not have hands. Memories did not collect trophies. Dead men did not return to their work. Marcus sat on the bathroom floor, and the internal voice that had been silent since the prison parking lot came back. It came back broken. It came back in fragments, like a radio signal degrading across distance, the words arriving out of order and repeating and correcting themselves mid-syllable. Not Perry's. These are not. Can't be. The tissue doesn't. There is no mechanism for. 6 months. He's been dead for 6. The watch was, I identified the cord at The cord is the same gauge I described because I knew the gauge not because Perry used it, because he watched his right wrist rotate, the small clockwise motion, smooth and habitual, identical to the gesture Edward Brandt had recognized with something that looked like love. Marcus watched it with terrible fascination and made no effort to stop it. His left hand lay in his lap, palm up, fingers slightly curled, and the positioning was the same. Hands placed palms up at the sides, fingers slightly curled. He was arranging himself the way he arranged them. The radiator ticked. The building settled. The television below droned its muffled syllables. Marcus sat on his bathroom floor and tried to build something, any structure that could hold the weight of what was in the box. Someone planted them. Ray found the closet panel somehow and planted the trophies to confirm what his notebook already suspected, to force a confession. The wood was worn smooth by the months of contact. Ray had been documenting inconsistencies for days, not months. The wear pattern predated the investigation. The wear pattern predated Marcus's return to duty. The wear pattern predated the brain surgery. His fingers had found the panel without searching. A copycat who had access to his apartment. Someone entering while he was at work, staging a false trail, using his closet as a dead drop. The brass clasp was tarnished in a pattern consistent with the oil of a single person's thumb. His thumb. He pressed it now, and his thumbprint settled into the existing impression like a key into a lock. Dissociative episodes triggered by the neural graft, his body acting without his knowledge, collecting objects from crime scenes during the attention gaps his neurologist had warned about. The same mechanism that produced the missing commute in the first week, the unexplained bruise, the residue under his fingernails. This explanation required his body to enter secured crime scenes, remove evidence without detection, transport it home, open a panel that was already worn smooth, and file each item in a wooden box arranged with the same care as the bodies themselves. This explanation required him to be the killer in every way except awareness, and the absence of awareness did not change what the hands had done. Every door led to the same room. He sat for 47 minutes. He counted them the way he had counted the 7 minutes in the car because counting was mechanical and required nothing of the self. His wrist rotated throughout. He let it. At minute 31, he picked up Karen Loomis's hospital badge and held it to the light and read her name and studied her photograph. And the tremor came again along the fault line. And this time he let it arrive. And what it carried was not horror, and not guilt, and not grief. What it carried was recognition. The calm, proprietary recognition of a craftsman reviewing his work. He set the badge down and pressed his palms flat against the cold tile and breathed. He could call Ray. He could place the box on the kitchen counter and call Ray's number and say the words that would end everything. I found something. Come to my apartment. Bring whoever you need to bring. The words existed. They were simple. They required only breath and vocal cords and the mechanical operation of a mouth forming syllables. The same operation that had said the cord was narrower by approximately a millimeter at the 11 o'clock briefing. The same operation that had said, Perry's tissue 8 hours ago, with the fluency of a man who had rehearsed his cover story so many times it had become indistinguishable from belief. He could confess. He stood up. He closed the box. He tucked it under his arm and put on his jacket and walked down 4 flights of stairs and out of the building and got in his car and drove. The city at 3 a.m. was a different organism than the city at noon. Quieter, slower. The street lights cast pools of amber on empty intersections, and the traffic signals cycled green to yellow to red for no one, and the river appeared between buildings in flashes of reflected light, black and patient and deep. He parked on a service road that ran along the bank. He had been here before. He knew this because his body moved with the economy of repetition, feet finding the path through the broken chain-link fence, hands adjusting for the angle of the slope, weight distribution shifting automatically on the muddy bank. His body had walked this path many times. His mind was visiting for the first time. He stood at the water's edge. The river moved slowly, carrying the reflected light of the city downstream in long, distorted streaks. He held the box in both hands. 5 items. Claire Hensley's cracked watch. A lock of hair tied with familiar cord. Diane Okafor's driver's license. A thin gold ring. Karen Loomis's hospital badge, days old, lanyard cut clean. He dropped the box. It hit the surface with a sound that was smaller than he expected, a brief, flat impact, and then the current took it. It turned once, twice, the brass clasp catching a glint of streetlight, and then the water closed over it, and it was gone. He stood at the bank and watched the place where the box had been until the ripples flattened and the river looked as though nothing had happened. Because that was what the river did. It received and it carried and it erased. And the evidence that something had been dropped became indistinguishable from the evidence of ordinary current within seconds. He drove home. He showered. The water was as hot as the tap could produce, and he stood under it until his skin turned red, and then stood longer. And when he scrubbed his hands, he used the dish brush from the kitchen, the stiff bristles meant for cast iron, and he scrubbed until the skin along his knuckles split and bled, and the water at his feet ran faintly pink. The same hands from the vision. The same hands that had held the cord. The same hands that had placed Claire Hensley's palms up, fingers slightly curled, with a care that was indistinguishable from tenderness. He turned off the water. He dried himself. He dressed in clean clothes. He sat on the couch in the dark. His phone buzzed. A voicemail left while he was at the river, while the box was sinking, while the water was closing over the evidence like a mouth swallowing a secret. He pressed play. Elena's voice filled the apartment for the second time in 12 hours. But this message was different from the one she had left earlier. This one had been recorded at 2:47 in the morning, her voice carrying the particular energy of someone who had stayed up too late following a thread and could not wait until a reasonable hour to share what she had found. Marcus, hey, I know it's the middle of the night. Sorry, I couldn't sleep. I've been going through Perry's correspondence, the letters to that researcher I mentioned, the one I haven't been able to identify. I found a reply. It was stuck between 2 pages of a genetic database printout, probably slipped there by accident. Marcus, the researcher, was at Mercy General, in the records department. Perry was getting help from someone inside the hospital, someone who had access to the unredacted files. The letter references specific infant records from a date I think you and I both recognize, February 9th. A pause, the sound of her shifting, papers rustling. I think Perry knew who the second coming killer was. I think he was building a case. I think that's what his letter to his parents meant. And I think the birth record, the one with the band discrepancy, is the key to everything. I'm going to try to track down the researcher tomorrow. If she's still at Mercy General, we might be able to get the full, unredacted record without even needing a subpoena. Another pause. Longer. When she spoke again, her voice had softened, the investigative urgency giving way to something more personal. I'm glad you're back, you know. I know that's a weird thing to say in a voicemail at 3 in the morning, but when you were in the hospital, after what happened with Perry, I kept thinking about how unfair it was. You went in there to stop someone, and you almost died for it. And now you're back, and you're helping, and I think you're a good person, Marcus. I think you're one of the good ones. She laughed, self-conscious, the small, embarrassed sound of someone who had said more than they intended. Okay, that was too much for a voicemail. Coffee tomorrow. I'll buy. Call me back." The recording ended. Marcus listened to it again. He sat in the dark with Elena's voice wrapping around the silence like a bandage around a wound that could not be closed. And he heard every word, and every word was a blade. And the blade was not in the words themselves, but in the distance between what she believed about him and what he now knew. "I think you're one of the good ones." The trophies were in the river. His hands were raw and bleeding under clean bandages he had wrapped in the bathroom. His name was underlined twice in Ray's notebook. Karen Loomis's badge was settling into sediment at the bottom of the current, her photograph dissolving in the dark water. And Elena Marsh was sitting in her apartment at 3 a.m, building the case that Nolan Perry had been building when Marcus killed him. February 9th. His birthday. The birth record. 2 infants in adjacent rooms. A flagged discrepancy. Perry had found someone inside the hospital who could unlock the full record. Perry had been close. Perry had been so close that whatever Marcus was, whatever mechanism lived in the architecture beneath his conscious mind, whatever inheritance expressed itself through his hands while his awareness slept, had identified Perry not as a suspect to investigate, but as a threat to eliminate. The realization settled into him with the weight of a thing that had always been true, a key turning in a lock that had been waiting for it. The confrontation 6 months ago, the struggle in an enclosed space, both critically injured, Perry dead at the scene. The department classified it as unavoidable escalation by a detective in pursuit of a dangerous suspect. It was not that. It had never been that. And this understanding, that the thing inside him had killed to protect itself, had used his badge and his authority and the department's trust as instruments of concealment, was the hinge on which everything that followed would turn. Marcus sat in the dark, and the fragments of his internal voice reassembled themselves into something that was not narration and not thought, but closer to a verdict, a judgment delivered by a court that had been in session for 28 years without his knowledge. Identity isn't what's inside your skull. It's what you choose to do with it. Elena had said that to him the evening they first really talked. In the parking lot outside the precinct late one night, she had shown him the 3 white scars on her left forearm and told him about choice, about the difference between what you carry and what you do with it. The words had comforted him then, in the way that true things comfort. They had unsettled him in the garage with Ray, when the temporal impossibility cracked open and the explanations began to fail. They had accused him there, too, in the garage, standing in the space where Ray had offered him the cross-contamination exit, and he had laughed the wrong laugh and chosen to hide what he felt. Now the words described what he had done. He had chosen. He had stood at the river and opened his hands and let the box fall and watched it sink. And that was a choice. And the choice was concealment. And the concealment was not the passive concealment of a man who does not know, but the active concealment of a man who does. He had chosen to hide. He had chosen wrong. The words did not comfort, and did not accuse, and did not unsettle. They simply named the thing he was in the voice of the woman who did not yet know she should be afraid of him. The apartment was quiet. The pipes ticked. The television below had finally gone silent. Marcus sat on his couch with his bandaged hands resting on his knees, palms up, fingers slightly curled, and he did not move. And outside the window, the city continued its slow rotation toward morning, toward coffee with Elena, toward the day when Perry's researcher would be found, and the birth record would be unredacted, and the truth would surface like a body from deep water. Because the truth always surfaced, and the river carried everything downstream eventually, even the things you dropped into it at 3 a.m, hoping they would never be found. His phone sat on the counter. The green light pulsed once, twice. Somewhere in Elena's apartment, the cardboard box of Perry's files sat open on her table, and inside it was the letter to his parents, and the birth record, and the genetic printouts, and the reply from the Mercy General researcher, and every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction, and Elena was following the trail the way a good journalist follows a trail, carefully, methodically, with the particular stubbornness of someone who believes the truth is worth finding. And she did not know that the trail ended here, in this apartment, in this man, in these hands resting palms up in the dark. Chapter 6. The Birth Record. Ray Castillo had been sitting at his desk for 40 minutes before anyone else arrived. The bullpen was dark, except for his lamp and the green standby light on the copier across the room, two small points of illumination in a space that felt larger without bodies filling it. The cleaning crew had come and gone an hour ago. He could still smell the pine solution they used on the floors, sharp and institutional, the smell of a place that processed human misery on a schedule and tried to sanitize the residue before the next shift. The subpoena had come through faster than he expected. Elena had told him about the Mercy General birth record, 2 infants, adjacent rooms, the identification band discrepancy buried by hospital legal. And he had filed for the unredacted records the same afternoon, using his active case authority to compel what Perry's research had only been able to obtain in censored form. 3 days from filing to fulfillment, which told him the hospital's legal counsel had been expecting the call for 28 years. Institutions buried things, but they did not forget where the graves were. And when a homicide detective with active case authority filed the paperwork, the calculation shifted from concealment to liability. The courier had delivered the sealed envelope to his desk yesterday afternoon at 4:12. He had signed for it, placed it in his bottom drawer beside the composition notebook, and left it there overnight. Not because he was afraid of what was inside, because he already knew, and knowing meant the envelope would make it real, and real meant he would have to act, and acting meant the end of something he was not ready to lose. He had opened it this morning at 5:15, standing in the parking garage under the buzzing fluorescent that had needed replacing for 6 months. His hands had been steady. That was the thing about grief you had already survived once. Your hands learned to be steady even when the rest of you was falling apart. Now the documents were spread across his desk in the order the hospital had filed them, not chronological, institutional. Intake forms first, then the attending physician's notes, then the nursing station log, then the administrative review that had been initiated, progressed through 2 meetings, and terminated with a legal department memorandum stamped with a date 11 days after the births in question. The memorandum was 3 sentences long. It recommended no further action. It cited insufficient evidence of harm. It was signed by a name he did not recognize and countersigned by the hospital's chief counsel, who had since retired to a house on a lake somewhere and was probably sleeping right now, untroubled by the knowledge that his signature had sealed the fate of 2 infant boys and everyone those boys would ever touch. The nursing station log was the document that mattered. 2 entries, written in the cramped, efficient hand of a woman identified only by her employee number and the initials RM. The first entry, timed at 11:47 on the morning of February 9th, noted that infant A, born in room 304 at 10:51, had been returned to room 306 following a routine heel-stick blood draw in the nursery. The second entry, timed at 11:53, corrected the first. Infant A belonged in room 304. Infant B, born in room 306 at 11:38, belonged in room 306. The identification bands had been cross-referenced, and the discrepancy had been flagged for the charge nurse, who had flagged it for the floor supervisor, who had flagged it for administration. Room 304 was assigned to a woman named Catherine Brandt. Her attending physician's notes described an uncomplicated delivery of a male infant, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, APGR scores of 8 and 9. The father was listed as Edward Brandt, occupation, thoracic, surgeon, staff privileges at this hospital. Room 306 was assigned to a woman named Jean Perry. Her notes described a slightly more complicated delivery, mild shoulder dystocia resolved without intervention, male infant, 7 pounds 11 ounces, APGAR scores of 7 and 9. The father was listed as Thomas Perry, occupation, high school teacher. 2 boys, born 47 minutes apart in adjacent rooms. One, the son of a surgeon who would later murder 7 people and remove their heads. The other, the son of a teacher. The nurse caught the mix-up within 6 minutes. Administration buried it in 11 days. And the wrong boy went home with each family, and neither family ever knew. And one boy, the Perry's biological son, raised as the Brandt's own until Edward Brandt's arrest, then surrendered by Catherine Brandt to the state and adopted by a couple named Cole, grew up to become a police officer who could not remember what his hands did while he slept. And the other boy grew up to become a medical resident who stumbled onto the truth and was murdered for finding it. Ray pressed his scarred knuckle against his jawline. The pressure helped. It always helped. A fixed point of sensation to anchor against when the world tilted. Marcus Cole was Edward Brandt's biological son. Nolan Perry never was. He had known. Some part of him had known since the composition notebook started filling, since the dates refused to align, since Marcus laughed that wrong laugh in the parking garage, and something in Ray's chest recognized the sound for what it was. Not nervousness, not deflection, but the brief, involuntary vocalization of a man whose internal architecture was splitting along a fault line he could not see. Ray had known the way detectives know things before the evidence arrives, the way the body knows a storm is coming before the sky changes. He had known, and he had kept the notebook, and he had laid Sophia's photograph face down because he could not look at her and pursue the thing he suspected. He turned the photograph face up now. She was still 22, still laughing, still wearing that blue shirt with the rolled sleeves, her dark hair caught mid-motion by whoever held the camera at the family barbecue where the light was good and the future was still intact. She had Ray's jawline and their mother's eyes, and she had been alive for 2 more years after that photograph. And then she had not been alive, and the man who killed her had a son, and Ray had spent the last 6 months bringing that son coffee and calling him partner, and gripping his shoulder like a brother, and telling himself the warmth was real. The warmth had been real. That was the cruelest part. Marcus's smile when Ray handed in the coffee on his first morning back. The way Marcus said his name, Ray, just Ray, the single syllable carrying weight and trust, and the particular gratitude of a younger man who had found in an older one the thing he needed. The 3-beat shoulder grip in the parking garage before Marcus drove north to visit Brandt. The pressure of Marcus's hand communicating something that felt like love, and might have been love, and was also, Ray understood now, the touch of Edward Brandt's son, saying goodbye to the man whose sister his father had decapitated. He was crying. He noticed it the way you notice rain that has already soaked your shirt. Not the onset, but the condition, already underway, already saturating. The tears moved down the deep-cut lines of his face and collected along his jaw, and he did not wipe them, because there was no one to see, and because wiping them would require moving his hand from the scarred knuckle pressed against bone, and the pressure was the only thing keeping him upright. Sophia looked at him from the photograph. She had no opinion, She had been beyond opinions for more than 20 years. But her face, caught in that moment of joy that the camera preserved and death could not reach, asked the question she would have asked if she were here, in her direct way, with the bluntness siblings used when love made politeness unnecessary. "What are you going to do, Ray?" He closed his eyes. He breathed. He counted to 11, always 11, the number of minutes on the dash cam, the number that meant he had given himself permission to feel, and now it was time to work. He opened his eyes and began organizing the documents into an evidence file. The precinct filled around him over the next hour. Detectives arrived. Phones started ringing. The coffee machine cycled through its morning complaints. No one approached his desk. He had a quality about him this morning that the other detectives recognized instinctively and respected. The containment of a man processing something that required distance. They gave him the distance. He used it. At 7:42, Elena Marsh walked through the double doors. And he saw her before she saw him. She moved differently than she had a week ago. The careful, warm alertness that characterized her, the way she held her shoulders, the measured pace of someone who had learned to scan rooms before entering them fully, had been replaced by something harder and more brittle. She was carrying a cardboard file box against her chest with both arms, the way you carry something precious or something that might burn you. And her hazel eyes were red-rimmed in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue and everything to do with crying that had happened recently and might not be finished. She found him across the bullpen. Their eyes met. He saw in her face the mirror of what he was feeling, the devastation of discovery, the particular anguish of having trusted and having been wrong, the terrible clarity that comes after denial has been stripped away and there is nothing left but the bare architecture of fact. She crossed the bullpen without speaking to anyone and set the box on the edge of his desk. She pulled the chair from the empty desk beside his and sat down. She did not say good morning. She did not ask how he was. She looked at the documents spread across his desk and at Sophia's photograph, face up again, and at his eyes, which he knew were still swollen, and she said one word. "Marcus." Not a question, a confirmation. Ray nodded. Elena pressed her palms flat on her thighs. Her fingers were trembling. The 3 white scars on her left forearm were visible where her sleeve had ridden up, and Ray looked at them and thought about Edward Brandt's knife, and Edward Brandt's son, and the 28 years of wreckage that a 6-minute identification band error and an 11-day administrative burial had produced. "Tell me what you have," he said. She opened the box. Her hands were steady now, the trembling pushed down by the same force of will that had carried her barefoot down 4 flights of stairs on Fulton Street with blood running from her forearm. She laid Perry's files on the desk beside the hospital documents, building a second column of evidence that mirrored Ray's. "I tracked down the researcher," she said. "Perry's contact at Mercy General. Patricia Huang, Records Department, retired 3 years ago. I found her yesterday afternoon. She confirmed everything. Perry came to her 8 months before he died with the redacted birth record and a theory about a chromosome 11 carrier who might have been misidentified at birth. She gave him access to the unredacted files. She gave him the names." Ray waited. He knew Ray. Nolan Perry knew exactly who the Second Coming killer was. He'd built the entire case. Genetic records, birth records, the identification band discrepancy, movement patterns, shift schedules cross-referenced against estimated times of death. It's all here. She placed her hand flat on the stack of papers. He was 8 months into the most careful, methodical investigation I have ever seen. And he was doing it alone because he knew that the suspect was a police officer, and he did not know who in this building he could trust. Ray looked at the files. Perry's handwriting was visible on the top sheet. Neat, slightly right-slanting, the disciplined script of someone trained to write legibly in medical charts. The same handwriting from the draft letter Elena had shown Marcus weeks ago. When they see what I found, they'll know I was trying to help. "There's a final entry," Elena said. She reached into the box and withdrew a single sheet of paper in a clear plastic sleeve. The sleeve had a crease across one corner, as though it had been gripped tightly by someone whose hands were not entirely steady. "He wrote this the week before he died. It was tucked inside the back cover of his research binder, separate from everything else. Like he knew it might be the last thing he wrote." She held it out. Ray took it. The handwriting was the same, but tighter, more compressed, as though the words had been formed under pressure. He read it slowly, hearing the voice of a man he had never met, a man whose reputation he had accepted as a monster's without question, a man who had died trying to do the right thing and been blamed for the crimes he was trying to stop. "If anything happens to me, these files are my testimony. I have documented everything I have found, the genetic evidence, the birth records, the pattern of access and opportunity. The person committing these murders is a member of the police department. I believe he does not know what he is doing. I believe the dissociation is genuine. I believe he was born in room 304 on February 9th at Mercy General and went home with the wrong family due to a clerical error that the hospital concealed. I do not know how to reach him without risking more lives, including my own. I am not the person they will say I am." Ray set the page down carefully. He aligned it with the edge of the hospital documents. The two evidence trails, his and Elena's, institutional records, and a dead man's testimony, touched at the border and formed a single coherent picture, so complete that no alternative interpretation survived. "He said the dissociation was genuine," Elena said quietly. "Perry believed Marcus didn't know." "Perry was a better man than the story we told about him. Perry was an innocent man who died because he found the truth." Elena's voice had the quality of someone forcing precision onto grief, each word chosen and placed with the deliberateness of a journalist filing a story that mattered. "And we put his tissue in the killer's brain. And we told ourselves the killer's visions were the victim's memories. And we let Marcus use that explanation to keep hunting while the thing inside him kept killing." Ray said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. It was accurate, and it was devastating, and it did not require his commentary. "He showed me kindness," Elena said, and her voice cracked for the first time. She recovered quickly, pressing her lips together, her hazel eyes bright with moisture she refused to release. "He listened to me talk about my scars. He told me I was brave. I showed him the worst thing that ever happened to me, and he sat there, and he was gentle. And I thought, here is someone who understands what it's like to survive something that should have destroyed you." She paused. "I gave him my philosophy about identity and choice, and he carried it around like armor. And the whole time, he was the thing I survived." Ray knew what it was like to have someone taken and the world get the story wrong. He knew it in his bones and his scar, and the 11 minutes on the dash cam, and the 20 years of mornings at this desk with Sophia's photograph watching him work cases that were never quite the case he needed to solve. He looked at Elena and saw the specific grief of a woman whose rebuilt instincts, the ones she had constructed brick by brick after a man with a surgeon's hands and a knife came through her neighbor's door, had led her directly toward the son of that same man, drawn by the gentleness that masked the same emptiness. "I know what it's like," he said, "to lose someone and have the world get the story wrong." Elena looked at him. She looked at the photograph of Sophia, 22, laughing, alive. "Your sister," she said. Brandt's final victim. 24 when she died. Graduate student. Wanted to teach. He paused. I've been looking for something to fill that space ever since. Marcus fit. He was the right age, the right temperament, said the right things. Made me feel like I had someone to protect again. He exhaled slowly, the sound of a man releasing 20 years of carefully maintained pressure, one controlled breath at a time. Edward Brandt's son, the headhunter's biological child. And I brought him coffee every morning and told him to call me if anything felt off. They sat with that for a moment. The bullpen noise filled the space around them. Ringing phones, a distant printer, two detectives arguing about a witness statement near the coffee machine. Normal sounds, the machinery of justice grinding through its daily output, unaware that two people at a desk by the window were holding the documents that would reshape every case the department had touched in the last 2 years. Ray reached for his phone and dialed Marcus's number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Marcus's recorded voice, measured, calm, precise, asked him to leave a message. Ray hung up without speaking. When did you last hear from him? He asked. I left him 2 voicemails, one yesterday afternoon, one at 2:47 this morning. Elena's face had gone still. He hasn't returned either one. Ray dialed again. 4 rings. Voicemail. He tried the precinct's internal line to Marcus's desk extension. Nothing. He didn't check in this morning, Ray said. He was already scanning the bullpen, already cataloging the empty desk that should have had Marcus's messenger bag beside it, the absent coffee cup that should have been sitting on the coaster with the chipped edge. He's not here, hasn't called dispatch, hasn't logged in. Elena was watching his face. She was a journalist before she was an advocate, and journalists read expressions the way detectives read crime scenes, for the detail that doesn't fit, the absence that speaks louder than presence. You're not just worried about where he is, she said. You're worried about who he's with. Ray looked at her. He looked at the scars on her forearm. He looked at the files spread across his desk, the birth records, Perry's research, the final testimony of an innocent man. And he saw the pattern that had been building since before any of them understood what they were looking at. The full arc of it now visible across every killing attributed to the Second Coming and the 2 new murders that followed. The killer's pattern was escalating. Laid out across the complete sequence, the victims told a story of tightening orbit. The original 5 Second Coming murders, Diane Okafor and the others, had been strangers, selected with apparent randomness, no connection to the killer's professional life. Then Claire Hensley, also random, also without connection, but committed after Marcus's return to active duty, after the surgery, after the department had placed a badge and case authority back in his hands. And then Karen Loomis, not random at all. A forensic technician who had processed evidence from his own crime scene. Each phase moved one step nearer to the center of Marcus's life, one step closer to the people he worked with, trusted, cared about. The progression had a logic to it, the logic of compulsion tightening its orbit. And at the center of that orbit was the person Marcus had let closest, the person he had shown his gentleness to, his composure, his careful and measured concern. The person whose philosophy he carried as armor against the truth about himself. Ray looked at Elena and saw the next victim. Elena saw his expression change. She saw the calculation move behind his dark eyes, the moment when grief surrendered command to the older, harder machinery of protection. Her face tightened. The color left her cheeks. But she did not look away, and she did not flinch, because she had stood in a doorway on Fulton Street at 23 and seen something worse than understanding in a colleague's eyes, and she had survived that, and she would survive this. "I'm the target," she said, not a question. Ray stood. His chair rolled back and hit the partition behind him. He was already reaching for his jacket, already calculating the steps between this desk and the captain's office and the dispatch board and the street. The grief was still there. It would always be there. Layered now. His sister's death underneath and Marcus's betrayal on top. A geology of loss that would take years to erode. But the grief had been transformed by the same mechanism that had gotten him through Sophia's crime scene 20 years ago. 11 minutes on the shoulder of the road, and then you work. You work because work is the thing that holds you together when love has been turned into a weapon against you. "We find him," Ray said. His voice was quiet. The fewer words Ray Castillo used, the more serious the situation. And right now, his sentences had been stripped to the minimum load-bearing structure. "We find him now." He picked up Sophia's photograph and held it for a moment. Her face, her laugh, her 2 years of remaining life frozen in silver and glass. And then he set it down again, face up, where she could watch him do what needed to be done. He gathered the documents into a single file. He placed Perry's testimony on top, where it belonged. He looked at Elena. "Stay close to me," he said. "Do not go anywhere alone. Do not answer if he calls." Elena nodded. She was already standing, the file box in her arms, her jaw set in the same way Decilla's had been set at the Loomis scene. The expression of a woman who has decided that breaking is not an option, and will deal with the cost of that decision later. Ray crossed the bullpen toward the captain's office. Behind him, his phone buzzed once on the desk, a text notification. He did not stop to read it. Ahead of him was the door, and behind the door was the captain, and behind the captain was the machinery of warrants and dispatches and the coordinated search for a man who had sat at the desk 6 feet from Ray's own and drunk coffee with 2 sugars and no cream, and killed people while he slept, and hidden the trophies in his closet, and dropped them in the river at 3 in the morning, and was now somewhere in this city, unreachable, his phone ringing to voicemail, his pattern tightening, his unconscious mind selecting its final target with the calm precision of a surgeon's son choosing where to place the blade. Marcus was out there. Marcus was not answering. And Elena was here, alive, standing, carrying the dead man's testimony in a cardboard box. And Ray Castillo was going to make sure she stayed that way if it was the last thing his badge was good for. He knocked on the captain's door. He did not wait for an answer. He walked in. Chapter 7. 1%. Cold. That was the first thing. Cold air moving across the backs of my hands. I came back the way you surface from deep water. Not all at once, but in stages, each one bringing a new sense online, like circuits firing in sequence. The cold air first. Then the smell, sharp and chemical, industrial solvent cut with something older and earthier beneath it. Concrete under my knees. The low, steady hum of a transformer somewhere in the walls, felt more than heard. My hands were moving. That was the second thing. My hands were already doing something, and my mind was arriving late to the act. The way you sometimes catch yourself driving a familiar route and realize you've made 4 turns without conscious decision. Except this was not driving. This was not a commute I had forgotten. My fingers were working a length of cord, thin, precise gauge, narrower than what I had used on Hensley by roughly a millimeter, and the motion was smooth and rehearsed and completely without hesitation. I looked down. The cord ran through my fingers in a double column wrap, a locking hitch forming at the end. The technique that was not in any database. The technique Edward Brandt had said required hands that knew the motion before the mind could think about it. My hands knew. I was kneeling on a concrete floor in a large, dim space. A warehouse or a garage, I could not tell yet, the edges still blurred. A single work lamp threw a cone of white light across the ground. I could see tools arranged to my left on a square of dark cloth, laid out with the care of a surgical tray, a second length of cord, a folding knife with the blade already open, zip ties in a neat row. Beyond the light, a vehicle, my car, I recognized the shape, was parked near a loading door. The space smelled of machine oil and solvent and cold concrete, and it smelled like every crime scene I had ever walked through with Ray, and it smelled like the inside of my own vision at 9:17 on the night before Claire Hensley was found. It smelled like my work. The cord in my hands was half finished. The double column knot was set on one end, tightened, the trailing length ready for the second wrist. I was kneeling at the right position, the angle correct, my weight balanced on both knees, exactly the way you would balance if you needed stability while working close to a body. And then I heard the breathing. Not mine, someone else's. Shallow, rapid, the kind of breathing that comes from a chest compressed by fear, or from lungs struggling against chemical fog, or from a person who has just begun to wake up and does not yet understand what is happening to them. I turned my head. Elena Marsh was on the floor 4 feet to my right. She was on her side, her dark hair loose from its twist and fallen across her face, her arms behind her, bound at the wrists with the same gauge cord tied in the same double-column knot. Her legs were free, her eyes were closed, but the lids were moving, rapid flutters, consciousness swimming up from whatever had pushed it down. She was wearing the same clothes I had seen her in at the precinct, the long-sleeved shirt that covered her scars, dark pants, practical shoes, one of which had come half off her left foot. The staging was half complete. The work lamp was positioned 36 inches from where her left shoulder would be if she was centered and placed on her back with her hands at her sides, palms up, fingers slightly curled. Adjusted inward for the darker warehouse floor. The same instinct that had moved the lamp from 37 inches at Hensley's storage unit to 38 at the Loomis parking structure, calibrating for surface albedo without conscious thought. I knew the distance was 36 inches because I had chosen it. Everything stopped. The hum of the transformer, the chemical smell, the cold concrete. All of it telescoped into a single point of clarity so total it was almost a sound, a high, thin ringing that filled the space behind my eyes. I looked at the cord in my hands. I looked at the tools on the cloth. I looked at Elena, breathing, her eyes beginning to open. I looked at my hands. They were my hands. They had always been my hands, the hands that scrubbed residue under the kitchen faucet until the water ran pink, the hands that found the hidden panel in the closet without searching, the hands that held Karen Loomis's badge to the bathroom light and felt the calm, proprietary recognition of a craftsman reviewing his work, the hands that carried a small, dark-stained box through a broken chain-link fence and dropped it into the river at 3 a.m. The hands that had tied Elena's wrists while my mind was somewhere else, somewhere dark and absent, somewhere the door was open and the thing behind it was free to work. I felt it then, the pull. It came from somewhere beneath thought, beneath language, beneath the architecture of who I believed myself to be. It came from the chromosome, from the gene, from whatever coded instruction had been written into me before I drew my first breath in room 304 at Mercy General on the 9th of February. The room where Catherine Brandt labored while a thoracic surgeon paced the hall. The room whose number I had learned only weeks ago from records that should have stayed buried. The gene did not care which family's name was written on the band they clipped to my wrist. It had traveled with me from room 304, through the clerical error that sent me home with the wrong family, through the state's custody after my biological father's arrest, through the couple named Cole who loved me and believed I was good. The gene was patient. It said, "Finish this. Complete the pattern. Place her on her back, hands at her sides, palms up, fingers curled. Position the lamp. Tighten the cord. Become what you were born to become." It was not a voice. It was not a command. It was gravity. The pull of water finding its level, of a river carving the path of least resistance, of every cell in my body aligning toward a purpose I had not chosen, but could not deny. My father's legacy, written in protein and salt and the spiral architecture of my DNA. 28 years of sleep, and then the waking. My right wrist began its rotation, the small clockwise motion that Edward Brandt had watched with recognition and satisfaction, and something he probably believed was love. My son used to do that. The motion that I had never noticed until he named it, and then could not stop noticing, and then could not stop. Except I was noticing it now. I was watching my wrist turn. I was present, awake, aware, and the mechanism that usually worked in the dark, behind the locked door while my conscious mind slept, that mechanism had been caught in the light. The door was open, and I was standing on both sides of it at once, the man and the monster sharing the same pair of hands. And for the first time, there was no dissociation to hide behind, no missing time, no fog, no careful forgetting. Just me, all of me, kneeling on a concrete floor with cord in my hands and a woman I cared about bound behind me, and the full weight of what I was pressing down on my chest like a stone. I stopped the rotation. It took everything I had. Not physical strength. The motion was small, barely visible, the kind of gesture that disappears in conversation. But stopping it required reaching into the place where my body ran on its own and overriding the circuitry that had been laid down before I was born. It felt like holding my breath underwater. It felt like pressing my hand against a wall and refusing to let it pass through. My wrist trembled. My fingers went white around the cord. And the rotation stopped. My wrist went still. It was the smallest thing, a barely perceptible interruption in a habitual gesture. No one watching would have noticed, but inside me, the silence that followed was immense. The silence of a machine that has been running for 28 years, suddenly finding one gear that will not turn. Elena opened her eyes. They found the ceiling first, then the lamp, then the concrete, then me. I watched the sequence of recognition move through her like electricity, the space, the restraints, the tools, and then my face, kneeling beside her, close enough to touch. Her hazel eyes went through confusion, and then comprehension, and then something worse, something that had no name. The expression of a woman who had survived one monster at 23 and rebuilt her life and trusted again, and now found herself on the floor of a warehouse looking at the second monster, wearing the face of the man she had trusted. Her breathing changed. The shallow, rapid rhythm became something controlled, something deliberate. She was managing herself the way she had managed herself on Fulton Street, barefoot, running down 4 flights with blood on her arm. She was choosing to survive. Again. Because surviving was what Elena Marsh did. Her mouth opened. The sound that came out was barely audible, less than a whisper. shaped by lips that were dry and a throat that was tight and lungs that would not give her enough air. She said my name. Just my name, Marcus. Not detective, not killer, not the thing behind the door. My name, the one my adopted parents gave me, the one Ray used when he handed me coffee, the one she had used when she invited me for coffee and told me she thought I was one of the good ones. She said it the way you call to someone you can still see but who is very far away, reaching for whatever was left of the person she had known, testing whether he was still in there. I did not answer. I could not. The cord was still in my hands and the pull was still there. The gravity, the gene, the weight of every ancestor I had never met and the one I had visited in a putty-colored room 200 miles north. Finish this, the weight said. She is just a pattern. She is just the next point on the tightening spiral. She is nothing. You are nothing. There is only the work. Elena's eyes stayed on mine. I watched her process everything, the restraints on her wrists, the tools on the cloth, my position, the staging she could feel in the arrangement of the space around her. She understood what was happening. She understood what I was. And she spoke again. Identity, she whispered. The word came out broken, cracked in the middle, barely held together. Identity is what you choose to do with it. The first time she said those words, they had been comfort. She had given them to me outside the precinct while showing me her scars, and they had felt like grace. The second time, alone in my apartment, they had been false comfort, a shield I held up against the questions I would not ask. The third time, they had become an accusation, because my choices, the silence, the scrubbed nails, the hidden birth record, were the choices of someone who was hiding. The fourth time, sitting in the dark after the river, they had been a verdict. My choice was concealment, active concealment, made by a man who knew. This time, they were something else. This time, Elena said my name first, and then gave me the words. And the combination was not comfort or accusation or verdict. It was an invocation. She was calling to me, calling to Marcus, and handing me the one thing that might still matter. A statement that said choice was possible, that what I did in the next 10 seconds would define me more than what my cells had been doing for 28 years. That my father's legacy was not the only instruction set my hands could follow. She said it, and I believed her. Not because I deserved to believe it, not because I was good, but because she was on the floor with cord marks on her wrists, and she still looked at me and spoke my name. And that act of impossible faith, or desperation, or defiance, or whatever you call it when a woman who has every reason to scream instead whispers, was the first thing in my entire life that felt more real than the pull. I opened my hands. The cord dropped to the concrete. The sound it made was very small. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Elena's phone. It was there because, of course it was. The mechanism had been thorough, taking her phone to prevent her from calling for help, the way it had obtained keys to unlock doors, the way it had adjusted lamp distances for surface conditions, the way it had done everything with the calm precision of a surgeon's hands. I unlocked the screen. I dialed Ray's number from memory. He picked up on the first ring. Elena. His voice was tight, controlled, and afraid in a way I had never heard Ray Castillo sound afraid. Where are you? Are you hurt? It's Marcus. Silence. A breath. Then nothing. The particular nothing of a man who has been preparing for a call he hoped would never come. Ray? My voice was clear, steady. For the first time in months, my internal narration matched what came out of my mouth. No doubling, no fracture, no correction mid-thought. The defenses were gone. Every rationalization, every constructed explanation, every story I had told myself about Perry's tissue and residual encoding and neural contamination, all of it had been stripped away. And what remained was just a man on a concrete floor telling the truth. I'm the one. The Second Coming murders, all of them. The 5 from last year, Hensley, Loomis, all of them. I heard Ray's breathing change. I heard the sound of his hand tightening on the phone. Elena is here, I said. She's alive. She's bound, but she's conscious and she's not hurt. I didn't finish. I stopped. Ray's voice came through very quiet. Where? I don't know the address. I'm in a warehouse. Industrial district, east side, I think. There's a loading dock. I can see a water tower from the door, red with white lettering. The door is open. I'll leave it open. Don't move. I won't. Marcus. His voice cracked on my name. Just once, a hairline fracture that opened and closed in the space of a syllable. Don't do anything. Stay on the line. I'm coming. I'm going to untie her first, I said. Then I'm going to sit on the floor with my hands visible. That's all I'm going to do. Ray said nothing. I heard the sound of keys, of a car door, of an engine starting. Then his voice again, stripped raw. I'm on my way. I set the phone on the ground with the line open. I turned to Elena. She had not moved. She was watching me with an expression I will carry for the rest of my life. Fear and recognition, and something I do not deserve to call hope, all held together by the same discipline that had carried her barefoot down 4 flights of stairs with blood running down her left forearm when she was 23. She did not flinch when I moved toward her. I reached behind her and found the knot at her wrists. My fingers knew the configuration. They had tied it after all. The double column wrap with the locking hitch, the same technique on every victim. I untied it with the same hands that had set it, and the cord came free, and Elena pulled her arms around to her front and pressed her wrists together and held them against her chest. The marks were already darkening on her skin. Dual impressions on the right, one on the left. The signature. My signature. I gathered the tools from the cloth. The second cord, the folding knife, the zip ties. I carried them to the loading dock door and set them on the ground outside, 6 feet from the threshold, visible from the entrance. Then I walked back inside and sat down on the concrete floor, 8 feet from Elena, and placed my hands flat on my knees, where anyone coming through the door would see them. My hands were still. My wrist was still. The rotation had not resumed. Elena sat against the far wall. She did not approach me, and she did not run. She pressed her back against the concrete and drew her knees up and wrapped her arms around them and watched. The stillness of a survivor assessing a situation, measuring distances, calculating options. Being present because being present was a choice, and she had made it. The way she had made it on Fulton Street, the way she had made it at every moment since, choosing to exist inside the reality of what was happening, rather than retreating into the easier dark. We sat in silence. The work lamp hummed between us, its cone of white light falling on empty concrete where a body should have been and was not. My hands rested palms up on my knees, fingers slightly curled. I noticed the position. The same arrangement I placed my victims in. The same configuration I had found myself in on the bathroom floor after the river, and in my apartment in the dark while Elena's voicemail glowed green. My hands had been rehearsing this position my entire life without my knowledge, and now, here, at the end, it meant something different. Not the staging of a kill, just a man with his hands open and visible, showing he holds nothing, showing he has chosen to hold nothing. The sound of sirens began in the distance, thin and faint, growing. Elena spoke once more before they arrived. Her voice was steadier now, the whisper replaced by something closer to her natural register, though rougher, as though her throat had been lined with sand. "You stopped," she said. I did not know if it was a question or a statement or something in between. I did not answer. There was nothing I could say that would be adequate. I had stopped, yes. I had also started. I had started 5 times before Hensley, and once with Hensley, and once with Loomis, and tonight with her. 1% of the time I stopped. 99% of the time, the thing behind the door had finished its work. The math was not in my favor. The math would never be in my favor. But Elena was alive. She was breathing. The cord marks on her wrists would darken and then fade, and one day they would be white and slightly raised, a second set of scars to join the 3 parallel lines on her left forearm. And she would cover them, or not cover them, and she would live her life, and that life existed because I stopped. The sirens grew louder, tires on gravel, doors opening, voices calling. Ray came through the loading dock door first. He came alone, his weapon drawn and low, his eyes sweeping the space in a single practiced arc. The lamp, the tools on the ground outside, Elena against the wall, me on the floor. Behind him, more lights, more voices, the machinery of justice arriving to do what it does. Ray holstered his weapon. He walked toward me. His face held everything and nothing. The gruff humor from the coffee station on my first day back, the 3-beat shoulder grip that had said, "Welcome home." The quiet afternoons reviewing case files while his composition notebook filled in the bottom drawer. Sophia's photograph turned face down and then face up. The nearly 30 years of grief that had led him to mentor a young detective who reminded him of his lost sister. And the discovery that the young detective was the biological son of the man who had taken her. He stopped 2 feet away. He looked down at my hands on my knees, palms up, fingers curled. He reached for his handcuffs. His hand found my arm, his grip wrapped around my bicep in exactly the same position, with exactly the same pressure as the shoulder grip he had given me on my first morning back. 3 beats, holding on, checking I was real. Except now it was a different kind of holding. It held me up, and it held me in custody, and it did both at the same time. Because Ray Castillo could not separate the 2 things, and perhaps never would. He pulled me to my feet. "Ray," I said, "I'm sorry. Not for this." I looked at the cuffs. "For every morning you trusted me, and shouldn't have." He said nothing. He turned me around and placed my hands behind my back and closed the cuffs with a quiet click that sounded exactly like the brass clasp of a small wooden box. He held my arm and walked me toward the door. At the threshold, I looked back. Elena was standing now. Paramedics were moving toward her. She had her arms crossed over her chest, her wrists still pressed together, and she was watching me leave. Her expression held 2 things simultaneously, and they did not resolve into one. I saw what I had almost done to her, and I saw what I had chosen not to do. And in the space between those 2 things was the entire question of whether my existence had been worth the cost. And her face offered no answer. I did not expect one. I did not deserve one. Ray guided me into the back of a squad car. The door closed. Through the window, I watched the loading dock, the flashing lights, the paramedics reaching Elena, the warehouse I had prepared and staged and brought her to while my conscious mind was asleep. I watched until the car pulled away and the scene shrank to a point of light, and then to nothing. My hands rested in my lap, cuffed, palms up, still. The public reckoning came quickly. Institutions move at the speed of liability once the exposure is certain, and the exposure was total. Marcus Cole, detective, Homicide Division, arrested and charged. The birth records from Mercy General released under court order. Room 304, Room 306. The swap, the burial, the 3-sentence memorandum signed by names no one recognized. The hospital issued a statement written in the language of regret without accountability, the kind of language that has been refined over decades of practice. Nolan Perry's name was cleared. Full posthumous exoneration. Official recognition as an innocent man who had identified the real killer, built a case alone because the suspect wore a badge, and he did not know who to trust, and died for it. His final testimony was read into the public record, every word from, "If anything happens to me," to, "I am not the person they will say I am." Elena Marsh ensured its inclusion. In the weeks that followed my arrest, she stood in front of a microphone and read Nolan Perry's words in his stead, her voice steady, and her hands steady, and her scars visible because she had rolled up her sleeves for the first time in public. Both sets of scars, the old ones from Fulton Street and the ones the cord had left on her wrists. And she did not explain them, and she did not hide them. The system that had accepted the comfortable lie, Perry as monster, case closed, move on, was named as complicit in his destruction. Every detective who had signed off on the investigation, every prosecutor who had built the narrative, every colleague who had shrugged and said it made sense. The reckoning was incomplete, as institutional reckonings always are. Exoneration cannot undo a death. A corrected record cannot return a man his life. But the record was corrected, and Nolan Perry's voice, preserved in his careful, right-slanting handwriting, finally said what no one had let him say while he was alive. He was not the person they said he was. He never was. Ray Castillo visited me once. The visiting room was smaller than the one where I had sat across from Edward Brandt, but the furniture was the same. Bolted table, molded plastic chairs, walls the color of something no one had bothered to name. Ray sat down and looked at me the way he had looked at me across the bullpen when his notebook was open on his desk, measuring, calculating, grieving. He spoke first. "You stopped?" "Yes." That mattered. His voice was quiet. His hands were on the table, the scar across his left knuckle catching the light. "I want you to know that. What you did at the end, calling me, not finishing, that was a choice, and it mattered." I waited. "But I cannot forgive what came before." He said it without anger, without bitterness, with the flat, exhausted precision of a man who has spent weeks weighing every word and arrived at the only ones that are true. 8 people are dead, Marcus. The 5 from last year, Okafor, the others, then Hensley, then Loomis, and Perry. You killed Perry because he was close to the truth, and then you used his tissue as a cover story. And I brought you coffee every morning and called you partner and told you to call me if anything felt off, and the whole time you were... He stopped. "I know," I said. "You knew. At the end, you knew, and you destroyed the trophies, and you chose to hide. You had a chance to stop it earlier, and you didn't." "I know." Ray looked at his hands. He pressed his thumb against the scar on his left knuckle, the gesture I had watched 100 times, the self-soothing tick that meant he was holding something so tightly inside that his body needed an outlet. He pressed hard enough that the skin around the scar went white. "Sophia would have been 52 this year," he said. "She wanted to teach." He stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. He looked at me one last time, the way you look at a house you lived in once, knowing you will never go back, and walked to the door and knocked twice for the guard. He did not look back. Elena Marsh did not visit. She chose not to see me, and I understood the choice, and I honored it. Because honoring someone's choice about their own safety was perhaps the first genuinely human thing I had done in my entire life. She continued her advocacy work. She had ensured Nolan Perry's voice was heard. She had read his words into the record. She did not regret telling me that identity is what you choose to do with it. She regretted only who had heard it. Edward Brandt was informed of my arrest in his cell 200 miles north. I was not there to see his reaction, but I was told about it later by someone who was, and what they described was this. He smiled. A gentle, patient smile. Not satisfaction at the capture, but pride. Quiet pride that the gene had expressed itself, that the variant on the short arm of chromosome 11 had done what it was designed to do, despite 28 years of nurture and normalcy, and a couple named Cole who had loved their adopted son and given him every advantage, and believed with their whole hearts that he was good. The gene won, his smile said. Nature won. I was right. Except, I stopped. I stopped the wrist rotation. I opened my hands. I dropped the cord. I dialed the phone. I untied the knots. I sat with my hands visible and waited for the man I had betrayed to come and arrest me. Edward Brandt never stopped. In 3 years and 7 victims, he never once looked at what he was doing and chose not to do it. He had no moment of awareness, no instant where the man and the monster stood on the same side of the door and the man prevailed. He simply was what he was, and he performed what he performed. And when they caught him, he was not surrendering. He was interrupted. I was not interrupted. I chose. That is the difference. It is a small difference. It does not bring back Claire Hensley or Karen Loomis or Diane Okafor or the others whose names I now know and will carry forever. It does not return Nolan Perry to his parents. It does not undo what my hands did while I slept. It does not comfort Ray Castillo or heal Elena Marsh, or answer the question that has been asked since Helen Sy sat in her laboratory at Johns Hopkins on a Tuesday in April and found a pattern in the protein that no one wanted to see. But it is the difference. The referendum failed by 4 points. Society chose to let the gene exist, trusting that environment and upbringing would hold the line. A noble conclusion. A bet. If I had been identified at birth, if the screening had been mandatory, if the 4 points had gone the other way, I would never have existed. No commute I could not remember, no residue under my fingernails, no trophies hidden behind a closet panel, no cord in my hands, no bodies on concrete floors. 8 people would have lived their lives. Nolan Perry would have completed his residency and perhaps published a paper on the thing he found in the hospital's buried records. Sophia Castillo would have become a teacher. But Elena Marsh would have died on a warehouse floor because I would not have been there to stop. 99% of the time, the gene means exactly what they say it means. 1% of the time, in one moment, in one person, something else happens. Something that looks like a wrist going still. Something that looks like a cord falling to concrete. Something that looks like a man on his knees choosing the hardest thing he has ever done, which is nothing, which is stopping, which is not finishing what his hands began. Is the 1% worth the 99? I sit in my cell with my hands on my knees, palms up, fingers slightly curled, and I do not know the answer. I do not think anyone does. I do not think anyone should. The question remains. Thank you for listening to The 1% by Nathan Voss, produced by Blue Coast Studio. Blue Coast Studio brings you new, full-length audiobooks regularly. So subscribe and tap the notification bell and stay tuned for more stories to come. This audiobook is protected by copyright, all rights reserved. Until next time, happy listening.